My
Good evening
stepson
and
Lucas
welcome to the
called me at
nightly
2 in the
news.
morning.
In our top story tonight,
His
the
voice
City
was
Council
trembling
approved
so
the
hard,
controversial
I could
budget
barely
plan after
understand the
hours of
words pushing
debate.
past his
Welcome back
panic.
to the afternoon update. We
Dad
are
hide
following
in the
breaking
attic, he
news
whispered
regarding
in
the
a sheer
proposed
breathless
infrastructure
terror.
project downtown.
He thought
City
he was
officials
warning
are
his
urging
father.
patience.
He thought
This
he
is
was
your
saving
midday
him.
news briefing. The Federal
But the
Reserve
line
announced
went
a
dead,
surprising
and
shift in
exactly
interest rates
5
this
minutes
morning,
later,
causing
the
immediate
heavy custom
fluctuations
oak
in the
front
global
door
markets.
of our Seattle
The finance
mansion
minister
was
stated
kicked
that the new
completely off
regulations
its
are
hinges.
expected to stabilize
Armed
the market
federal
following
agents
yesterday's
swarmed my pristine
fluctuations. We'll have
foyer
more
with
on that after the
flashlights
break.
cutting through the dark. And the person they slammed onto the hardwood floor, the person they dragged out into the freezing Pacific Northwest rain in pajamas and handcuffs, was me. I am 34 years old. I am a certified public accountant with a spotless record. And I spent the last 10 years of my life building a financial and emotional fortress for a family that I thought loved me. I had absolutely no idea that I was merely the scapegoat waiting for the slaughter. To understand how I ended up shivering in the back of an FBI vehicle while my neighbors peered through their plantation shutters, you have to go back 12 hours earlier. 12 hours before the raid, I was standing in my massive gourmet kitchen, carefully preparing a standing rib roast for a Sunday dinner party. Our home was nestled in one of the most affluent manicured suburbs of Seattle. It was the kind of elite neighborhood where the lawns looked like green velvet and the people judged your moral character by the brand of your luxury SUV. My husband Julian was a charismatic, highly successful commercial real estate developer. When we first met, I was young, ambitious, and on the fast track to becoming a senior partner at a top-tier accounting firm downtown. But Julian had a grand vision for his life, and he convinced me that we needed to build his empire together. He told me he needed someone he could trust completely to handle the complex back-end financials of his rapidly growing firm. Because I loved him with everything I had, I stepped away from my own corporate dreams. I took over his books. I structured his limited liability companies. I spent countless nights poring over tax codes and saved his firm hundreds of thousands of dollars in liabilities over the years. I was the silent engine behind his massive success. I built the wealth that paid for the $3.4 million roof over our heads. That Sunday evening, we were hosting a lavish dinner for some very prominent members of our church congregation. These were wealthy, influential people. They were the sort of suburbanites who prayed loudly and performed charity on Sunday mornings, but traded vicious gossip and insider investment tips in the church parking lot. I had spent 2 exhausting days preparing the house and cooking the meal from scratch, wanting everything to be perfectly flawless for Julian. But the moment my mother-in-law Beatrice walked through the double doors, the warmth in my home turned to absolute ice. Beatrice was a woman who wielded her old money pedigree like a loaded weapon. She wore tailored designer suits and looked at the world as if it constantly disappointed her. From the day Julian married me, she made it crystal clear that a girl from a hard-working blue-collar family was not good enough for her golden son. At the dinner table, the crystal glasses clinked and the expensive wine flowed. Beatrice made sure to command the center of attention. She sat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table from Julian, sipping her Pinot Noir and holding court with the church elders. I was quietly serving the second course, moving behind the guests, when Beatrice looked right past me and addressed the pastor's wife. "Julian has always had such refined and sophisticated taste," she said, speaking loudly enough for the entire dining room to fall dead silent. "We were so terribly worried when he started his business that he might have to settle for a mediocre life. Thank goodness he found a nice, simple girl like Chloe to manage the mundane paperwork so he could truly fly high. A simple girl. That was her polite, socially acceptable code for my middle-class background. I grew up in a family where we earned every single dime we had and stretched every dollar to the end of the month. Beatrice had never forgiven me for not bringing a massive trust fund or a powerful family name into her bloodline. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks and my stomach twist with humiliation, but I kept my polite host smile firmly plastered on my face. I looked over at Julian sitting at the head of the table. I expected him to intervene. I expected my husband to say something to defend the woman who had practically engineered his wealth and raised his teenage son. But Julian just chuckled softly, took a casual sip of his wine, and told the table that his mother always spoke her mind. He let her humiliate me in my own dining room in front of our community. The real sting came right after dessert was cleared. Beatrice decided she wanted a group photo of the family to commemorate the evening for her social media. She directed everyone into the grand living room, positioning them perfectly in front of the massive marble fireplace. I wiped my hands on a towel and stepped up to stand next to Julian, resting my hand gently on his arm. Beatrice immediately waved her hand at me like she was shooing away a stray dog. "Oh, Chloe dear," she said with a tight, condescending little smile. "Could you be the one to take the picture for us? We just want the actual family in this one. The blood relatives, you understand." I stood frozen on the Persian rug. I had been faithfully married to Julian for 6 years. I had helped raise his teenage son Lucas from a previous marriage, treating that boy with all the fierce love and devotion of a biological mother. I cooked, I cleaned, I managed their finances, and I kept their lives running smoothly. And yet, in front of a dozen wealthy guests, Beatrice was physically and metaphorically cropping me out of my own family. I looked at Julian again, pleading with my eyes for him to finally take a stand. He gently patted my hand and whispered a command into my ear. "Just take the picture, Chloe, and please do not make a scene." I swallowed the heavy, bitter lump in my throat. I stepped back, taking the camera phone from his mother. I held my breath and snapped the photo of my husband smiling brightly next to the woman who despised me, completely erasing my existence from the frame. By 11 that night, the last guest had finally gone home. Beatrice had kissed Julian on the cheek, ignored me entirely, and climbed into her waiting town car. Julian told me he was exhausted from entertaining and headed upstairs to take a shower, leaving me entirely alone to clean up the wreckage of the evening. The house was dead quiet, save for the sound of the heavy autumn rain lashing against the large glass windows of the dining room. I moved mechanically through the space, gathering the heavy crystal wine glasses and scraping the fine china plates. I kept telling myself that I was just overreacting. I told myself that family dynamics are always complicated and that Julian was simply trying to keep the peace with a difficult mother. That was the desperate lie I had been feeding myself for years to justify the invisible chains I wore. As I walked out into the grand entryway, I noticed Julian had draped his expensive tailored suit jacket carelessly over the back of a chair instead of hanging it in the hall closet. I sighed and picked it up to put it away properly. As I shifted the heavy wool fabric, something fell out of the inner breast pocket and fluttered softly to the hardwood floor. I bent down to pick it up. It was a crumpled piece of thermal receipt paper. I smoothed it out under the dim golden light of the foyer chandelier. It was a wire transfer confirmation from a private wealth management bank that we absolutely did not use for our regular business operations. The amount printed on the receipt made my breath catch violently in my throat. $450,000. The routing destination was a hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands. As a certified public accountant, I personally oversaw every single cent that flowed in and out of Julian's business and personal accounts. A transfer of this massive magnitude, completely undocumented and deliberately hidden off the books, was a glaring, terrifying red flag. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached back into the inner pocket of his jacket, my fingers trembling uncontrollably. I pulled out something else. A sleek black plastic hotel keycard from a hyper-luxury resort located in downtown Seattle, just 10 miles away from our house. The pieces of a horrifying puzzle began to snap together in my mind with brutal clarity. The late nights at the office he claimed were necessary. The sudden unexplained weekend business trips. The defensive way he would guard his cell phone whenever I walked into the bedroom. And now, a hidden wire transfer of nearly $500,000 and a hotel room key. My hands shook so violently that the black keycard slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor. He was not just cheating on me with another woman. He was systematically draining our assets. He was moving massive amounts of capital into the shadows. I stood in the quiet hallway, feeling the solid ground entirely drop out from under my feet. The sacrifice of my promising career, the quiet daily humiliations I endured from his terrible mother, the absolute blind trust I had placed in him for a decade. It was all a complete fabrication. I grabbed the offshore receipt and the hotel keycard and shoved them deep into the pocket of my jeans. I turned and marched toward the grand staircase. I was going to walk right up those steps, march into our master bathroom, tear back the glass shower door, and demand the absolute truth. I was going to make him look me in the eye and explain the missing $500,000. I put my foot on the first wooden step. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed softly, marking exactly 2:00 in the morning. And then my cell phone rang. The sudden shrill sound of the ringtone cut through the quiet house like a blaring siren. I pulled the phone from my pocket, expecting to see a wrong number at this hour. But the glowing screen displayed the name of my stepson, Lucas. He was supposed to be staying the night at a friend's house across town. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Lucas," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the pure adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Are you okay?" That was when I heard his trembling, breathless voice. "Dad, hide in the attic." The line went completely dead. I stood paralyzed on the bottom step, staring down at the dark screen of my phone, my mind unable to process what I had just heard. A second later, a loud, booming crash echoed from the front of the house. The heavy custom oak door splintered inward and gave way with a violent, shattering crack. Bright tactical flashlights cut blindly through the darkness, and men in heavy body armor poured into my beautiful, pristine foyer. Federal agents were screaming for everyone to get down on the ground. Before I could even open my mouth to scream, a heavy hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around and forcing me face down against the cold hardwood floor. The cold, brutal steel of handcuffs snapped tight around my wrists, and the nightmare I never saw coming officially began. I felt the rough texture of the oak floor pressing into my cheek. Heavy boots pounded on the stairs. Men in dark tactical gear were shouting commands, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the foyer I had painstakingly decorated just hours before. The metal of the handcuffs bit painfully into my wrists, twisting my shoulders into an unnatural angle. I gasped for air, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. I tried to speak to tell them they had the wrong house, but a heavy hand pressed between my shoulder blades, keeping me pinned. I turned my head wildly, searching the darkness for Julian. Where was my husband? I waited for him to rush down the grand staircase to demand what these men were doing to his wife to protect me. But the staircase was completely empty. The lead agent shouted that the perimeter was secure and the target was not on the premises. The target. My brain struggled to process the terminology. They grabbed me by the arms and hauled me roughly to my feet. My knees buckled, but they held me up, marching me toward the shattered front door. The cold night air hit my face like a physical blow. I was wearing thin silk pajamas, entirely unprepared for the freezing Pacific Northwest rain that was washing over our property. As they dragged me down the wide aggregate driveway, the sheer scale of the nightmare came into view. There were at least 6 black unmarked vehicles blocking the street, their red and blue tactical lights spinning wildly, painting our pristine neighborhood in harsh, frantic colors. The rain soaked through my clothes in seconds, sticking the thin fabric to my shivering skin. But the cold was nothing compared to the burning shame that washed over me when I looked across the street. Lights were flicking on in every single house. The massive oak doors of the neighboring mansions crept open. People I knew, people I served on the homeowners association board with, were stepping out onto their covered porches, clutching their thick robes. I saw Susan and Mark, the couple who had been sitting at my dining room table just hours earlier, drinking my wine and eating the dinner I had cooked from scratch. They were standing under the glow of their porch light, staring at me with wide, horrified eyes. I tried to call out to them. I tried to tell them there was a terrible mistake, but a federal agent put a heavy hand on my head and shoved me downward into the cramped, dark back seat of an SUV. The doors slammed shut, sealing me inside a cage that smelled of damp vinyl and stale coffee. I was shivering uncontrollably, the wet silk clinging to my trembling body. I stared out the rain-streaked window as the vehicle pulled away from the $3.4 million estate I had helped build, watching my entire life recede into the darkness. I kept repeating Julian's name in my head like a prayer. I convinced myself that he had been delayed at the office, that he would meet me downtown with our team of corporate lawyers, that he would wrap his arms around me and pull me out of this terrifying misunderstanding. The ride to the federal building felt like a descent into an alternate reality. The blinding fluorescent lights of the processing area seared my eyes. They took my fingerprints. They took my photograph. They took my dignity. I was led down a long, sterile corridor that smelled strongly of industrial bleach and floor wax. They put me in a small, windowless interrogation room, shackling my wrist to a metal ring bolted to the heavy steel table in the center of the room. The air conditioning blasted from a vent above, freezing the damp clothes against my skin. I sat there for what felt like days, the ticking of the wall clock echoing in my ears, every second stretching into an eternity of panic. Finally, the heavy metal door clicked open. A man in a sharp gray suit walked in carrying a massive, thick binder. He introduced himself as Special Agent Reynolds. He did not look angry. He did not look aggressive. He looked at me with the tired, clinical exhaustion of a man who dealt with criminals for a living. He sat down across from me, placing the heavy binder on the metal table with a loud, definitive thud. I leaned forward as far as the metal chain would allow. "Please," I begged, my voice hoarse and trembling. "You have to call my husband, Julian Sterling. He is a prominent developer. He can clear all of this up. We are good people. There is a massive mistake here." Special Agent Reynolds did not reach for his phone. He did not offer me a shred of comfort. Instead, he unclasped the thick binder and flipped it open. "I do not think there is a mistake, Chloe," he said quietly. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. "We have been tracking these accounts for 18 months. He slid a glossy photograph across the scratched metal table. It was a blown-up high-resolution image of the exact same wire transfer receipt I had found tucked inside Julian's tailored suit jacket just hours ago. The receipt for $450,000 routed to a shadowy offshore bank in the Cayman Islands. My heart stuttered. I stared at the paper. "I know about this," I said quickly, desperate to prove I was cooperating. "I found this tonight. My husband must be a victim of corporate theft. I am a certified public accountant. I manage his books. If someone is siphoning capital from his real estate firm, I can help you track them down. Let me look at the ledgers." Agent Reynolds tilted his head, studying me like I was a puzzle he had already solved. "You manage his books," he repeated slowly. "You are a licensed CPA with full access to his financial architecture." "Yes," I said, nodding frantically. "I stepped down from a corporate firm to manage his accounts. I know every legitimate vendor. I know every property tax code. I can prove to you that whoever did this is hiding in his supply chain." Reynolds sighed. He reached into the binder and pulled out a stack of pristine, legally binding documents. He spread them out across the table, fanning them so the signature lines faced me. "This is not corporate theft, Chloe. This is a highly sophisticated, meticulously structured tax fraud and money laundering syndicate. And the person running it is not hiding in the supply chain." I looked down at the top document. It was a formal article of incorporation for a limited liability company, a shell corporation registered in Delaware. I scanned the corporate structure, my trained eyes easily translating the complex legal jargon. The LLC was designed to receive massive, unrecorded cash injections from Julian's real estate projects, wash the funds through fake vendor invoices, and funnel the clean money directly into foreign tax havens. It was a brilliant, highly illegal financial ghost ship. But it was not the fraud that made the breath completely leave my lungs. It was the name printed on the line for the chief executive officer, Chloe Sterling. I stared at the black ink, my vision blurring. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, I never signed this. I never opened this company." Reynolds slid another document forward. This one was a commercial banking authorization form for a massive offshore account. The primary account holder was Chloe Sterling. Next to my printed name was my exact encrypted digital signature. The very same digital signature I used to file our legitimate corporate taxes. I scrambled to read the next page, then the next. property deeds transferred to the shell company, loan agreements borrowing millions against non-existent assets, wire transfer authorizations moving obscene amounts of wealth out of the country. Every single page, every single illegal transaction bore my name and my verified electronic signature. The reality of what I was looking at hit me with the force of a freight train. The gut punch was so severe, so physically painful, that I actually doubled over, gasping for air against the cold metal table. Julian had not just cheated on me. He had not just stolen money. He had spent the last 2 years methodically and deliberately building a massive criminal empire entirely in my name. Every time he had asked me to verify a password so he could update our software, every time he had asked to borrow my laptop to check a quick file while we were sitting in bed, he had been using my credentials to authorize federal crimes. He had weaponized my blind absolute devotion. He knew that because I loved him, I never questioned his requests. Because I was a licensed CPA, my signature carried total financial authority. He had perfectly engineered the ultimate corporate crime, and he had flawlessly crafted me as his human shield. The sickening truth crashed over me. That was why Lucas had called and told his father to hide in the attic. Julian knew the raid was coming. Julian had packed his bags, cleaned out the untraceable cash, and vanished into the night, leaving me sleeping peacefully in our bed to take the fall for his entire syndicate. While Beatrice was making me take the family photo while she was smirking and calling me a simple girl, they knew I was about to be arrested. They knew I was the sacrificial lamb. Agent Reynolds leaned back in his chair, watching the horror wash over my face. He did not look sympathetic. He looked at me the way the world looks at a white-collar criminal caught red-handed. "The paper trail is absolute, Chloe Reynolds," said his voice hard and uncompromising. "You are the sole legal executive of the shell company. The digital authorizations originated from your verified credentials. The funds moved through accounts registered to your social security number. We have a mountain of evidence, and your husband has completely disappeared. You are holding the bag for over $12 million in laundered assets." I sat frozen, the cold metal of the handcuff chain biting into my skin. My beautiful home, my quiet life, my spotless career. They were all gone, evaporated into thin air, replaced by the sterile walls of a federal holding cell. The man I had poured my entire soul into had meticulously plotted my destruction. He had smiled at me over morning coffee while forging my name on documents that would destroy my life. "You are facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary," Reynolds said, leaning forward across the table, invading my space. The words hung in the freezing air, suffocating and final. 20 years. 2 decades behind concrete walls and iron bars, stripped of my freedom, branded a felon, while Julian lived in luxury on a tropical beach with the millions I had unwittingly helped him steal. Reynolds tapped a pen against the metal table, the sharp, rhythmic sound cutting through my shock. "We know you did not act alone. But right now, you are the only one sitting in this room." He pushed a blank confession statement and a pen across the table until they rested inches from my trembling hands. He locked his eyes onto mine, his expression demanding total surrender. "Are you ready to confess, Chloe?" The pen sat on the scratched metal table, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room. Agent Reynolds leaned back in his chair, watching me with the cold, detached certainty of a man who believed he had just caught a mastermind. He wanted a confession. He wanted me to sign my life away and accept 20 years in a federal penitentiary for crimes I did not commit. My hands were shaking so violently that the handcuffs rattled against the heavy steel ring bolted to the desk. I looked at the blank confession form, and then I looked at the forged signatures on the stack of corporate documents. I was a 34-year-old woman sitting in damp silk pajamas, but beneath my sheer terror, the mind of a certified public accountant began to violently wake up. I closed my eyes and took a deep, ragged breath. The panic that had been suffocating me for the last 4 hours suddenly receded, replaced by a freezing, absolute clarity. Crying was not going to save me from federal prison. Screaming about my innocence was not going to save me. Numbers were going to save me. I pushed the blank confession statement back across the table. I am not signing that, I said, my voice dropping an octave, steadying into the same professional tone I used when dismantling aggressive tax auditors. I am a licensed CPA agent Reynolds. I gave up my track to senior partner to manage my husband's real estate portfolio. I know exactly how forensic accounting works. I know that ink and digital signatures can be forged, but digital footprints cannot. I want to see the raw transaction logs. I want the metadata. I want the IP addresses for every single one of those wire transfers. Reynolds scoffed, folding his arms across his chest. You do not get to make demands, Chloe. We have the routing numbers. We have the authorization codes mapped directly to your digital credentials. It is over. It is not over, I fired back, leaning forward as far as the metal chain would allow. If I were the criminal mastermind you think I am, I would have covered my tracks better than leaving a paper trail leading directly to my own social security number. You are looking at the execution of the fraud, but you are completely ignoring the origin. Someone had to physically hit enter on a keyboard to move those funds. Where did those commands come from? Show me the IP logs. He stared at me for a long, heavy moment. Perhaps he saw the desperate, unyielding fire in my eyes. Or perhaps his own investigative instincts kicked in, realizing that a guilty woman would be begging for a lawyer rather than demanding raw data. He stood up without a word and left the interrogation room. The heavy steel door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the freezing silence. Time crawled by. I sat there shivering, praying to God that my instincts were right. 30 minutes later, the door opened. Reynolds walked back in, holding a thick stack of printed spreadsheet logs. He dropped them in front of me. These are the network logs, provided by the bank for the dates the offshore accounts were opened and the major transfers were executed, he said, his voice tight with skepticism. Show me what you think you are going to find. I pulled the stack toward me, my eyes scanning the columns of raw data. My fingers traced the rows of dates, times, amounts, and IP addresses. I ignored the forged signatures completely and focused entirely on the digital origin points. I scanned the first major transaction, a wire transfer of $850,000 executed on November 14th, 2 years ago. I looked at the IP address associated with the login. I moved to the next massive transfer, November 16th, $2 million routed through a holding company. The exact same IP address. I checked the geolocation coordinates printed next to the network data. The transfers were not executed from our home in Seattle. They were not executed from Julian's corporate office downtown. They originated from a specific network block in Scottsdale, Arizona. My heart hammered against my ribs. I flipped rapidly through the pages, comparing the dates of the largest financial movements. Almost every single illicit transfer over $1 million happened during a specific 2-week window in November. I knew exactly where Julian was during those 2 weeks. He and his mother Beatrice had flown down to a hyper-exclusive luxury golf resort in Scottsdale. They claimed it was a crucial networking retreat for wealthy real estate developers. I was supposed to go with them to handle the client dinners, but I never made it on the plane. Agent Reynolds, I said, pointing a trembling finger at the spreadsheet. Look at these origin points. Look at the physical location of the device that authorized these transfers. Scottsdale, Arizona. He leaned over, examining the data. It is a resort hotel network, he said, frowning. So what? You could have been there on vacation. I was not, I said, my voice thick with rising emotion. 2 years ago, during that exact week in November, I contracted a severe case of bacterial pneumonia. I was fighting for my life. Pull up my medical records right now. Call Seattle General Hospital. I was admitted to the intensive care unit on November 12th. I was placed on a ventilator because my oxygen levels crashed. I was unconscious and intubated for 3 entire days. I physically could not have logged into a banking portal to authorize a $2 million offshore wire transfer. Reynolds stared at me, his skeptical demeanor fracturing. He looked from my face down to the spreadsheet and then back to me. Julian was at that resort. I continued, the words rushing out of me as the horrible reality solidified. He went to Arizona with his mother. They left me in the hospital in Seattle. He texted me from the golf course saying he was praying for my recovery. While I was lying in a hospital bed with a tube down my throat, my husband was sitting in a luxury suite using my digital credentials to build a criminal empire and frame me for money laundering. The interrogation room went completely silent. The only sound was the harsh hum of the fluorescent lights above us. Agent Reynolds slowly reached out and pulled the spreadsheets back toward his side of the table. He did not say a word. He did not offer an apology. He just picked up his phone, dialed a number, and ordered someone to verify the admission records for Chloe Sterling at Seattle General Hospital for November of that specific year. He told them to get the attending physician on the line immediately. He walked out of the room again, and this time he was gone for a very long time. I sat in the cold room watching the hands of the wall clock tick past 4 in the morning, then 5, then 6. I was exhausted to my very bones. My silk pajamas had dried, but they felt like sandpaper against my skin. Every muscle in my body ached from the brutal tension of the night. But beneath the physical pain, a profound vindication was blooming in my chest. I had fought back. I had used my brain and my education to punch a massive hole in Julian's flawless setup. Just past 7 in the morning, the heavy door opened. Agent Reynolds walked in, but his entire posture had shifted. The aggressive interrogator was gone, replaced by a man who realized he had just participated in the absolute worst night of an innocent woman's life. He walked behind me, and with a sharp metallic click, he unlocked the handcuffs. The heavy steel chain fell away from my bruised wrists. I rubbed my skin, wincing at the deep red marks left behind. "We got your medical records, Chloe," he said, his voice completely devoid of its previous hostility. "We confirmed you were on a ventilator when the primary offshore accounts were opened and the largest transfers were executed. The geolocation data places your husband Julian at the resort during those exact timestamps. We are officially changing your status. You are no longer the primary suspect. You are a victim of severe identity theft and corporate fraud." I let out a breath that I felt like I had been holding for my entire life. The relief was so intense it made me dizzy. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Where is Julian?" "He fled," Reynolds replied, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "The local police found his Porsche abandoned at a private airfield outside the city. We believe he boarded a charter flight out of the country before we even breached your front door. He knew we were closing in. He left you holding the bag, assuming you would go down for everything while he disappeared with the funds. We are issuing an international warrant for his arrest, but for now you are free to go. We are releasing you on your own recognizance, pending the formal dismissal of the charges against you." I was escorted out of the interrogation area and led through the labyrinth of the federal building. A female officer handed me my personal belongings in a clear plastic bag. My wedding ring, my driver's license, the crumpled wire transfer receipt, and the black hotel key card I had found in Julian's jacket. They had seized my cell phone for evidence, but they allowed me to make one phone call from the front desk. I did not know who to call. My entire social circle consisted of Julian's wealthy friends and his toxic family. I had isolated myself for a decade to serve a man who ultimately tried to destroy me. I chose not to call anyone. I just needed to get home. I needed to stand in my own house, wash the smell of the federal prison off my skin, and figure out how to survive the wreckage of my life. I walked out the heavy glass doors of the federal building into the cold, gray Seattle morning. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets slick and reflective under the overcast sky. I was a terrible sight. A woman in wrinkled, damp pajamas wearing a cheap, oversized fleece jacket an officer had taken from the lost and found. I flagged down a passing yellow taxicab. The driver looked at me with deep suspicion, ready to roll his window up and drive away. "Please," I said, gripping the edge of his open window. "I need to get to my home in the suburbs. I do not have my wallet, but I have emergency cash in a safe in my master bedroom. I will pay you triple the fare the moment we pull into the driveway. Please just take me home." He studied my bruised wrists and my desperate, exhausted face. With a heavy sigh, he unlocked the back doors. "Get in," he muttered. The drive back to the suburbs felt like navigating through a strange dream. I watched the towering skyscrapers of downtown Seattle give way to the sprawling evergreen trees and the massive gated communities of my neighborhood. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window, closing my eyes. I envisioned my beautiful gourmet kitchen, the warm mahogany floors, the soft, luxurious bed where I could finally collapse and cry out the sheer horror of the betrayal. I had survived the FBI. I had proved my innocence. I just needed the sanctuary of my own home to begin putting the shattered pieces of my reality back together. The taxi turned onto my familiar tree-lined street. I sat up preparing to give the driver instructions on where to park. We rounded the final corner and the massive $3.4 million estate came into view. But as the taxi rolled to a stop at the end of my long driveway, the breath was violently knocked out of my lungs all over again. I stared through the rain-streaked window, completely paralyzed. The large custom oak front door that the FBI had kicked in was already being replaced by a private contracting crew. And standing on the wide concrete porch holding steaming cups of coffee and wearing triumphant smiles were my mother-in-law, Beatrice, and Julian's entitled sister, Brenda. Next to them, resting squarely on the front steps, were two large black garbage bags, bursting with the cheap clothes I had brought into the marriage a decade ago. I stepped out of the taxi, the cold morning air biting into my skin, staring at my own front porch, and realizing with absolute terror that the nightmare had not ended. It was only just beginning. The taxi came to a halt at the bottom of the long, sweeping driveway. I handed the driver the last bit of emergency cash I had scraped together from the pocket of my oversized fleece jacket. He took the money without a single word and sped away quickly, leaving me standing completely alone in the freezing Seattle drizzle. My silk pajamas were still damp beneath the heavy jacket the police officer had given me from the Lost and Found. I stood on the wet pavement and looked up at the massive $3.4 million estate I had personally helped build. The custom oak front door that the federal agents had kicked in was already completely boarded up and secured with a heavy temporary deadbolt by a private contracting crew. And there, resting squarely on the immaculate concrete porch, sat two large black plastic garbage bags. I walked slowly up this winding stone path toward the house. Every single step felt like lifting a solid block of lead. I desperately told myself there had to be a logical explanation for this. I reached the porch and looked down at the bags. The cheap plastic was stretching and tearing at the seams. Inside, I could clearly see the faded gray fabric of an old college sweatshirt and a pair of worn-out denim jeans. They were the cheap clothes I had brought into this marriage exactly 10 years ago. Everything else I owned, the designer dresses, the expensive winter coats, the tailored business suits I wore to Julian's corporate events, were nowhere to be seen. They had literally bagged up the poor version of Chloe and thrown her out onto the front steps like actual garbage. I reached out for the digital keypad mounted next to the front door. My fingers were completely numb from the biting cold, but I managed to punch in my highly secure entry code. A harsh red light blinked back at me immediately. Access denied. I tried again, pressing the numbers carefully. Access denied. A thick wave of panic began to violently claw at my throat. I pulled out my cell phone and opened my secure banking application. I needed to see our joint accounts right now. I needed to hire a ruthless defense attorney. I needed money to simply survive the night. The application loaded slowly on my screen and my heart stopped dead in my chest. The primary checking account, which held over $200,000 just yesterday morning, now showed a balance of exactly $0. The joint savings account was $0. The emergency corporate fund I had painstakingly managed for years was $0. Julian had completely drained every single account we shared before he vanished into the night. I was a fully licensed, certified public accountant who had generated millions of dollars in wealth for this family, and I was standing on a freezing porch with absolutely nothing to my name. Before I could even process the reality of the empty bank accounts, the heavy temporary door clicked open. The warm golden light of the grand foyer spilled out onto the wet concrete of the porch. Standing in the doorway, perfectly dry and impeccably dressed, were my mother-in-law, Beatrice, and Julian's younger sister, Brenda. Brenda was the absolute picture of suburban entitlement. She wore a pristine white cashmere sweater and held a steaming mug of expensive artisanal coffee. She had never worked a hard day in her entire adult life, surviving entirely on a massive trust fund Julian had set up for her, using the very corporate profits I had generated. Beatrice stood right beside her, radiating pure malicious triumph. They looked down at me, shivering in my damp pajamas and cheap fleece jacket, with absolute unfiltered disgust. "What are you doing here, Chloe?" Beatrice asked. Her voice was as cold and sharp as broken glass. I stared at them, my mind desperately struggling to bridge the gap between the family I had served for a decade and the cruel strangers standing before me. "This is my house," I said, my voice trembling uncontrollably in the cold air. "I live here. Where is Julian? Why are my clothes packed in garbage bags?" Brenda took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. "You do not live here anymore," she said with a highly smug smile. "Julian is gone, and he made sure to completely protect his real family before he left." Beatrice stepped forward and dropped a thick manila folder onto the top of the wet garbage bags. The heavy paper slapped loudly against the plastic. "You have incredible nerve showing your face in this neighborhood," Beatrice spat. "After what you did to my poor son. After you dragged our respectable family name through the mud and brought the Federal Bureau of Investigation to our front door. You are a dangerous criminal. We always knew you were nothing but a common thief trying to steal our generational wealth." "I am completely innocent," I cried out, taking a desperate step toward the door. "Julian forged my signature on every single document. He set me up to take the fall. The federal agents know he fled the country. They are tracking him right now. You know exactly what he did to me." "Oh, shut up," Brenda snapped, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Julian warned us you would try to spin some pathetic little lie. He told us you were secretly funneling his hard-earned money into your own illegal offshore accounts, and that the authorities were finally catching up to you tonight. He had to leave to protect his remaining assets from your greedy hands, and he made perfectly sure you could never steal from us again." I reached down with shaking hands and picked up the thick manila folder. The freezing rain was already starting to warp the paper. I opened it and stared down at the legal documents inside. The very first page was an emergency petition for the dissolution of marriage. Julian had filed for a rapid divorce the exact moment he knew the federal raid was imminent. But it was the second document in the stack that made the breath violently leave my lungs. It was an ex parte restraining order signed by a local county judge. I read the words printed on the official court order and felt a profound, sickening wave of nausea wash completely over me. Julian had sworn under the strict penalty of perjury that I was a dangerous, unstable federal criminal. He claimed in the legal filing that I had physically threatened his life when he discovered my supposed financial crimes. He told the judge that he feared for the safety of his entire family and required an immediate order of protection. The judge had granted it, granting Julian the exclusive use of the primary residence and completely freezing all of my access to any marital assets or properties. "You cannot be within 500 feet of this property," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with pure, cruel satisfaction. "You cannot contact my son. You cannot access the bank accounts or the vehicles. If you take one more step toward this front door, Brenda will call the police immediately and have you arrested for violating a direct court order. You are going straight back to a holding cell where you belong." I looked directly at Beatrice. I had spent 10 long years cooking her elaborate holiday meals, organizing her high society charity galas, and managing her complicated personal tax returns entirely for free. I looked at Brenda. I had literally paid off her massive hidden credit card debt 3 years ago, so her wealthy husband would not find out and divorce her. I had given these two women a decade of my absolute loyalty and protection. "You know this is a complete lie," I whispered, tears finally spilling over my freezing cheeks and mixing with the cold rain. "You know I built this wealth. You know I loved him with everything I had." Beatrice actually smiled. It was a cold, dark, utterly merciless smile that chilled me straight to the bone. "Love does not matter in the real world, Chloe," she said softly. "Power matters. Money matters. Blood matters. You were a very useful employee for a very long time. You kept the books exceptionally clean, and you kept the house quiet. But you were never truly part of this family. Julian finally realized that leaving you was his best choice. Now pick up your trash and get off my property before I call the authorities to remove you. Brenda giggled softly, holding her warm coffee mug. It was a vicious, high-pitched sound that cut right through my soul. Bye, Chloe. She mocked, waving her fingers at me. Good luck in federal prison. The heavy door slammed shut right in my face. The deadbolt clicked loudly into place, echoing across the large porch. The outdoor light was flicked off, leaving me standing entirely in the pitch-black darkness of the Seattle storm. I bent down slowly and picked up the 2 tearing garbage bags. They were shockingly light. 10 years of faithful marriage reduced to a few pounds of discarded fabric. I dragged them down the wet driveway, my bare feet slipping in the cold puddles. I reached my old reliable sedan parked out on the street. It was a cheap car I had intentionally kept for years to avoid spending marital funds on myself, so Julian could buy his luxury sports cars. Thank God I had my spare key hidden in a small magnetic box under the rear bumper. I unlocked the door, threw the wet bags into the back seat, and collapsed heavily behind the steering wheel. The moment the car door closed, shutting out the sound of the rain, the full crushing weight of the ultimate betrayal finally fell upon me. I gripped the cold steering wheel and screamed. I screamed until my throat was completely raw and tearing. I sobbed uncontrollably, experiencing the kind of deep, agonizing weeping that feels like your chest is being physically ripped wide open. I had given them my youth. I had sacrificed my brilliant corporate career. I had trusted a man who slept beside me every single night while meticulously planning to send me to a federal penitentiary so he could steal millions of dollars. I was completely penniless, shivering in a freezing car, and entirely alone in the world. The profound sheer agony of total betrayal washed over me, drowning my spirit in pure, impenetrable darkness. I cried for the family I truly thought I had. I cried for the naive, trusting woman I had been just yesterday morning. I cried for a solid hour while the heavy rain hammered relentlessly against the windshield, blurring the massive house I used to call my home. And then, completely and suddenly, the tears simply stopped. I sat up straight in the driver's seat. I wiped my wet face roughly with the sleeve of the oversized fleece jacket. I took a deep, slow, steadying breath that filled my lungs with cold air. The overwhelming, paralyzing grief that had just completely consumed me began to harden. It crystallized in my chest, turning into something cold, sharp, and highly dangerous. They thought I was a simple girl. They thought I was a naive little housewife who would just roll over, cry, and take the fall for their crimes. They forgot one very important, fundamental detail. I was a certified public accountant. I knew exactly how to track every single hidden dollar. I knew how to read dense corporate bylaws better than most corporate attorneys. Julian wanted to completely destroy me using the complex legal and financial systems, but those systems were my absolute native language. I reached into the back seat and pulled my laptop out of the side pocket of my discarded garbage bags. I powered it on the bright white screen, fully illuminating the dark interior of the cold car. I quickly connected to a nearby open public wireless network. I pulled up the official state corporate registry database. I needed to see the exact structural documents of the fraudulent shell company Julian had created. I needed to trace the specific limited liability company that held my forged digital signature as the chief executive officer. Beatrice and Brenda thought they had won the war. Julian thought he had completely escaped into the sunset. I typed my own name into the search bar, my fingers flying rapidly and flawlessly across the keys. They were about to learn that you never ever corner a forensic financial auditor who has absolutely nothing left to lose. The sun came up over Seattle, painting the rain-soaked streets in a dull gray light. I had spent the entire night shivering in the back seat of my old reliable sedan, surrounded by the 2 black plastic garbage bags that held everything my husband and his family believed I was worth. My neck ached terribly, and my thin silk pajamas were stiff and uncomfortable, beneath the oversized fleece jacket the police officer had given me. But the crushing, paralyzing despair that had completely consumed me yesterday was entirely gone. In its place was a sharp, burning, and absolute clarity. I was a licensed, certified public accountant. I understood complex financial systems. I understood hidden asset trails. I knew exactly how wealthy, arrogant men tried to manipulate the law because I had spent a decade legally minimizing tax burdens for one of them. And I knew exactly what I needed to do first. I needed hard capital. Julian had ruthlessly drained all of our joint checking and savings accounts to zero before he vanished into the night, leaving me entirely penniless on the street. But in his frantic rush to escape the federal authorities, he had forgotten one incredibly valuable asset that was still physically attached to my body. My engagement ring. It was a massive, flawless 3-carat diamond set in heavy platinum. When he slipped it onto my finger 6 years ago, looking deep into my eyes, he had told me it was a physical symbol of his eternal protection and unconditional love. Now that piece of compressed carbon was going to be the literal weapon I used to completely dismantle his life. I drove my beat-up sedan to a heavily fortified pawn shop in a gritty commercial strip mall, far away from the manicured lawns of our affluent suburban neighborhood. The man standing behind the thick, bulletproof glass looked at my wrinkled, damp clothes and the dark purple bruises circling my wrists with obvious suspicion. He took the platinum ring, examining the diamond closely under a bright fluorescent magnifying light. He offered me $35,000 in cash. I knew it was barely a third of what the diamond was actually worth on the open market, but I did not hesitate for a single second. I took the heavy stacks of $100 bills, stuffed them deep into a generic brown paper grocery bag, and walked straight back out into the freezing morning rain. I did not want a polite country club lawyer who played golf with the judges on the weekends. I did not want a gentle mediator who would try to find a polite civil compromise with a man who had intentionally framed me for massive federal crimes. I wanted an absolute bulldog. I drove straight to the downtown office of Robert Hayes. Robert was a seasoned, ruthless defense attorney in his late 60s. He did not have a slick modern office with expensive glass walls and leather couches. His workspace smelled strongly of stale black coffee and was crammed with towering, disorganized stacks of legal paper. He had a fierce reputation in the city for utterly despising arrogant white-collar criminals and financial abusers. He took one long look at my bruised wrists, my exhausted, pale face, and the brown paper bag full of cash that I dropped heavily onto his cluttered desk, and he sat down to listen. I told him absolutely everything. I told him about the horrifying 2 in the morning phone call, the terrifying FBI raid, the offshore wire transfers, the forged electronic signatures, and Julian fleeing the country like a coward. I told him about Beatrice and Brenda standing on the front porch with their smug, entitled smiles, locking me out of my own home and handing me an emergency ex parte divorce petition. Robert did not interrupt me a single time. He sat back in his worn office chair, taking meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad, his jaw clenching tighter and tighter with every single detail I shared. When I finally finished speaking, he looked at me with cold, highly calculating eyes. He told me that Julian had executed a nearly flawless, sophisticated corporate crime. But Robert also told me that deeply arrogant men always make one fatal, catastrophic mistake because they firmly believe they are the absolute smartest people in the room. He took my case on the spot. We did not have to wait very long for Julian's legal team to make their first aggressive move. Just 2 days later, a couriered package arrived at Robert's downtown office. It was a formal settlement offer drafted by Julian's high-priced corporate attorneys. I sat perfectly still in Robert's leather guest chair as he read the demanding terms aloud. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the legal document made the blood absolutely boil in my veins. Julian was generously offering me a single lump sum payment of $50,000 to start my life over. In exchange, I had to sign a strict, ironclad non-disclosure agreement promising never to speak to the media. I had to accept the divorce without contesting any division of their marital assets. And most importantly, I had to completely agree to take a formal plea deal with the federal prosecutors confessing to all of the wire fraud and money laundering charges, taking the full solitary blame, so Julian could eventually return to the country with his public reputation completely spotless. $50,000. That was the pathetic price tag he put on my life. That was the value he assigned to 20 years rotting away in a federal penitentiary. He wanted me to go to prison and legally absolve him of all his devastating crimes, and he actually thought 50 grand and a thinly veiled threat of total financial ruin would make me surrender. Beatrice and Brenda had probably helped him draft that very document, laughing together over their expensive morning coffees, about how incredibly quickly the simple girl from the wrong side of the tracks would break under the heavy legal pressure. I did not shed a single tear. I stood up, reached directly across the desk, and pulled the massive stack of Julian's fraudulent corporate documents toward me. These were the exact same documents the federal agent had thrown in my face in the interrogation room. The same documents bearing my perfectly forged digital signature. Robert and I sat in his office for 14 straight hours drinking terrible coffee and manually tracing the complex legal structure of every single shell company Julian had created. We tore apart the foundational paperwork for the primary limited liability company that Julian had used to funnel the stolen money offshore. The specific entity was called Apex Holdings. Julian had officially listed me as the sole legal chief executive officer of Apex Holdings to completely ensure that the federal authorities would look entirely at me when the massive tax fraud was finally discovered by the government. I started carefully reviewing the detailed asset transfer logs for Apex Holdings. Julian had used the shell company to wash illicit money, but as I dug deeper, I realized he had also used it for something else. He had used it to hide his most valuable physical assets from the Internal Revenue Service. I read through a thick property transfer deed from 18 months ago, and suddenly my breath stopped completely in my throat. I read the legal description of the property on the page. I read the specific parcel number. I read the exact street address. I pushed the heavy document across the desk to Robert, my hands trembling with an entirely new thrilling kind of adrenaline. Robert put on his reading glasses and scanned the dense legal page. He looked up at me, his eyes growing wide with absolute genuine shock. He actually let out a loud, sharp bark of disbelief. In a desperate attempt to shield his most prized possession from potential tax audits and to deeply irrevocably entangle me in the massive fraud, Julian had legally transferred the deed of our sprawling $3.4 million Seattle estate completely out of his own personal name. He had formally deeded the massive mansion directly into the ownership of Apex Holdings. Julian had been entirely blinded by his own massive toxic hubris. He was so incredibly focused on making absolutely sure I was the legal face of the criminal enterprise that he completely forgot the most basic foundational rule of corporate legal structure. Because I was the legally documented sole chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, I possessed total absolute legal authority over every single asset that the shell company owned. Julian did not own that $3.4 million house anymore. Beatrice did not own that house. Brenda did not own that house. I owned the house. I had the absolute legal power to sell it, to liquidate it, or to immediately evict the vicious women who were currently sleeping in my custom beds and drinking expensive wine in my gourmet kitchen. Julian, in his desperate, arrogant attempt to frame me for federal crimes, had literally handed me the legal keys to his entire kingdom. He had locked me out of the front door without realizing that I legally owned the very ground he built the house on. A fierce, triumphant fire ignited deep in my chest, spreading rapidly through my veins. I wanted to march over to that sprawling suburban estate right this very second. I wanted to call the local county sheriff, present the stamped corporate deed, and physically drag Beatrice and Brenda out onto the rainy street by the collars of their expensive cashmere sweaters. I wanted them to feel the exact same freezing, desperate humiliation they had so gleefully inflicted on me when they threw my clothes out in garbage bags. I stood up from the chair, my heart pounding, ready to draft the immediate eviction notices and take back my property. But Robert raised his hand, stopping me dead in my tracks. He looked at me with the stern, highly calculated gaze of a legal veteran who knew how to win wars, not just small battles, He warned me that if I moved too quickly right now, I would trigger a massive catastrophic alarm. If I took back the house today, Julian's attorneys would instantly notify him that I had discovered his fatal legal error. Julian was currently hiding offshore with millions of dollars in highly liquid stolen assets. If he knew I had found the loophole, he would immediately scatter those offshore funds into untraceable cryptocurrency accounts forever, and he would permanently slip out of the reach of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We had the house, but the house was simply not enough. I did not just want to take his luxury roof. I wanted to see him locked in cold steel handcuffs. I wanted to watch his entire carefully constructed life completely shatter into a million unrecoverable pieces. Robert leaned across his cluttered desk and told me the hard, undeniable truth of our situation. To permanently freeze the offshore accounts and guarantee a massive federal conviction against Julian, we needed absolute, undeniable proof that he had forged those electronic signatures himself. We needed solid proof that his mother Beatrice was entirely complicit in the elaborate frame-up. The paper trail we found was incredibly strong, but a secretly recorded verbal confession would make our case absolutely bulletproof to any jury. I needed them to proudly admit what they had done. I needed to continue playing the pathetic defeated victim a little while longer. I needed to let them truly believe they had won the war completely, so their profound family arrogance would make them reckless and careless. I needed a stage for my performance. I could not simply invite my mother-in-law to a quiet coffee shop or a public park. Women like Beatrice thrived on the misery of others, and I needed her to feel completely socially superior to me in every possible way. I drove my old sedan to a decaying industrial stretch on the outskirts of the city. I found a rundown motel that rented rooms by the week. The neon sign out front was buzzing and half burned out. The parking lot was full of cracked asphalt and deep rain puddles reflecting the harsh yellow streetlights. It was the absolute exact opposite of the pristine $3.4 million suburban estate I had lived in for the last 10 years. I paid the tired desk clerk in cash, using the money I had gotten from pawning my engagement ring. He handed me a physical metal key attached to a heavy plastic diamond and pointed me toward the second floor. The room smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial pine cleaner. The carpet was a faded, murky brown covered in questionable dark stains. The bedspread featured a hideous floral pattern that had probably been vibrant 3 decades ago. I sat down on the edge of the sagging mattress and looked around the dismal space. To an ordinary person, this room would represent absolute rock bottom. To a forensic certified public accountant building a federal trap, this room was the perfect theater. Robert Hayes. My ruthless defense attorney had provided me with a highly specialized piece of equipment before I left his downtown office. It looked exactly like a standard cheap digital alarm clock. The red numbers glowed brightly against the black plastic casing. But hidden completely out of sight inside the speaker grill was a high-definition wide-angle camera equipped with a sensitive directional microphone. I placed the clock carefully on the battered laminate nightstand. I adjusted the angle so the lens perfectly captured the 2 cheap vinyl chairs sitting by the curtained window. I tested the audio feed connecting the hidden device to my laptop. The sound of the rain hitting the motel roof came through crystal clear. My trap was fully operational. Now I just needed to lure the absolute worst person in the world into the room. I purchased a cheap prepaid cell phone from a convenience store down the street. I did not want Beatrice tracking my actual location or discovering I had retained high-powered legal counsel. I sat back down on the sagging bed and prepared myself mentally. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to feel the raw, genuine agony of the betrayal I had suffered. I thought about Julian draining our accounts. I thought about Brenda laughing at me on the freezing porch. I thought about the federal agents throwing me to the hardwood floor in handcuffs. I let the sheer terror and the profound humiliation wash completely over me until hot, heavy tears began to spill down my cheeks. When my chest was heaving and my throat felt tight and raw, I dialed Beatrice on the prepaid phone. She did not answer the first time. She let it go directly to voicemail. That was her classic power play. She wanted me to know that my time was completely worthless to her. I waited exactly 30 minutes and called her back. This time she answered, but she did not say a single word. She just opened the line and waited for me to beg. "Beatrice," I sobbed, my voice cracking perfectly. "Please do not hang up on me. Please, I am begging you." I heard a soft, satisfied sigh on the other end of the line. "What do you want, Chloe?" she asked, her tone dripping with utter condescension. "You are a dangerous federal suspect. I really should not be speaking to you without Julian's legal team present. I do not have anyone," I cried, letting my voice rise in desperate panic. "I am staying in a terrible motel out by the highway. I do not have any money left. The bank accounts are completely frozen. I am so absolutely terrified of going to a federal prison. I do not know what to do. Please, Beatrice, I will do whatever Julian wants. I will sign the divorce papers. I will sign the federal confession. I just need a little bit of help to survive. I just want this nightmare to end." I let a heavy, desperate sob echo through the phone. I knew exactly how to manipulate the deep, dark vanity of a wealthy narcissist. Beatrice had spent 10 years treating me like an uneducated peasant who was lucky to be allowed in her presence. By playing the completely broken, helpless victim, I was giving her the ultimate emotional high. I was surrendering to her absolute superiority. There was a long silence on the line. I could picture her standing in her massive, pristine kitchen, swirling a glass of expensive wine, calculating how she could use my total despair to permanently protect her golden son. "Text me the address of your motel," she finally said, her voice cold and completely devoid of any human empathy. "I will be there in exactly 1 hour. Do not attempt to contact anyone else, or I will personally call the federal agents and tell them you are a flight risk." She hung up the phone. I lowered the prepaid device and immediately stopped crying. My face was wet, but my hands were completely steady. I walked over to the bathroom sink and splashed cold water on my face, making sure my eyes looked red and heavily swollen. I rummaged through the garbage bags and put on the most worn-out, faded college sweatshirt I owned. I wanted to look exactly like the pathetic, defeated failure they always believed I was. I went over to the nightstand, double-checked the hidden camera feed on my laptop, and then closed the computer, hiding it under a pillow. I sat in one of the vinyl chairs by the window and waited in the quiet darkness of the motel room. Exactly 1 hour later, 3 sharp, rapid knocks echoed against the thin wooden door. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump forward into a posture of total defeat. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Beatrice stood under the flickering yellow light of the motel walkway. She looked entirely out of place, her expensive tan trench coat and designer leather handbag clashing violently with the chipped paint and rusted railings of the cheap building. She looked past me, scanning the interior of the cramped, dingy room with a look of absolute sheer revulsion. She stepped inside, refusing to take her shoes off, holding her expensive purse tightly against her chest, as if she was afraid the poverty of the room might somehow rub off on her clothing. I closed the door behind her, securely locking us inside the trap. "This place is completely disgusting," Beatrice said, wrinkling her nose as the smell of stale smoke hit her. "But I suppose it is exactly what you deserve after what you tried to do to my son. It is highly fitting for someone of your background." I kept my head bowed, staring submissively at the stained carpet. "I did not try to do anything to Julian," I whispered, my voice trembling with practiced fear. "I swear to you, Beatrice, I never opened those offshore accounts. I never moved any money. I do not understand how any of this is happening to me." Beatrice let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She walked confidently toward the center of the room, stepping perfectly into the clear, wide-angle frame of the hidden camera. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out 2 items. One was a thick legal document bound in a blue cover. The other was a heavy, thick manila envelope. She tossed both items onto the faded floral bedspread. They landed with a heavy, solid thud. "Julian is a very generous man, despite your profound betrayals," Beatrice said, crossing her arms and looking down at me with pure venom. That envelope contains exactly $50,000 in unmarked, untraceable cash. It is more money than a simple girl like you could ever hope to see in a lifetime. The document is an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and a fully prepared legal confession to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You will sign both documents right now. You will take the cash, and you will plead guilty to every single charge of wire fraud and money laundering. Julian will then gracefully proceed with the divorce, and he will allow you to keep the cash to buy extra commissary items while you serve your sentence. I looked at the thick envelope of cash, and then looked up at her, letting fresh tears fill my eyes. I sank down onto the edge of the mattress, letting my shoulders violently shake. Why is he doing this to me? I cried out, pleading directly to the camera lens hidden behind the digital numbers of the clock. Why did Julian do this? I loved him. I managed his company perfectly. I cooked your holiday meals. I raised his son. Why am I the one taking the fall for federal crimes I did not commit? I needed her to brag. I needed her massive ego to completely take over the conversation. I needed her to explicitly detail the conspiracy out loud on crystal-clear digital audio. Beatrice could not resist the absolute golden opportunity to gloat over her defeated enemy. She took a step closer, looking down at me as if I was an insect she was preparing to finally crush under her expensive heel. "You really are incredibly stupid, Chloe," she sneered, her voice dripping with sheer arrogant triumph. "Did you honestly believe a man like my son Julian would ever build a permanent empire with a glorified blue-collar secretary like you? You were never his equal. You were just a highly convenient idiot." I looked up at her, my face a perfect mask of confusion and sorrow. "What do you mean?" I whispered. "Julian planned this exactly 2 years ago," Beatrice declared, proudly completely oblivious to the digital eye recording her every single word. He needed a completely clean, untraceable fall guy to shield his offshore wealth from the Internal Revenue Service. He knew you were so desperately in love with him that you never questioned a single document he asked you to review. He forged your name perfectly. He mapped your electronic signature onto every single illegal bank transfer. It was absolutely brilliant. You essentially built his massive fortune, and then you kindly provided the exact federal shield he needed to escape with it. My heart was racing 1,000,000 miles an hour in my chest. The evidence was absolute gold. I had an uncoerced, clear verbal confession from a direct co-conspirator, fully admitting to the entire federal wire fraud and identity theft operation. But I needed one more piece of the puzzle. I needed her to explicitly link herself to the current cover-up. "But you know he is guilty," I cried, gripping the edge of the mattress. "You are his mother. You are helping him frame an innocent woman. You are just as guilty as he is." Beatrice laughed again, a cold, dark sound that echoed terribly in the small motel room. "Guilt is for poor people, Chloe," she said, smoothing the front of her trench coat. "The federal agents do not care about the truth. They care about the paper trail. And the paper trail leads directly to your bank accounts. I personally watched Julian forge the final batch of corporate authorizations while we were relaxing at the golf resort in Arizona. While you were whining in a hospital bed on a ventilator, we were securing generational wealth. So stop crying and pick up the pen. You are going to sign the federal confession right now." I slowly reached out and touched the heavy envelope of cash. I took a deep, shaky breath, looking up at her with red, swollen eyes. "I need more time," I whispered. "I need to read the legal documents carefully before I throw my entire life away. Please, Beatrice, just give me 2 days to process this." Her eyes narrowed in deep irritation, but she looked at the squalor of the room and clearly decided I was absolutely no threat to her grand plan. "Fine," she snapped, adjusting her purse on her shoulder. "You have exactly 48 hours. Our friends are gathering at the house this Friday night for a celebratory dinner to support Julian through this difficult divorce. You will bring the signed confession and the signed non-disclosure agreement to the house on Friday. You will walk in hand over the documents, apologize for your crimes, and then you will disappear completely. If you fail to show up, Julian's lawyers will direct the federal agents to this exact motel room, and you will not get a single dime of that cash." I nodded submissively, staring down at the floor, I will be there on Friday, I promised her. Do not be late, Beatrice warned, turning toward the door. And try to wear something presentable. I do not want you tracking the stench of this horrible place onto my clean hardwood floors. She opened the door and stepped out into the damp night air, slamming the heavy door firmly behind her. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sharp click of her expensive heels fading away down the concrete walkway. I waited until I heard the distant roar of her luxury SUV speeding out of the parking lot. The moment the sound of her engine vanished, I stopped crying entirely. I stood up, wiped my face with a rough paper towel from the bathroom, and walked straight over to the battered nightstand. I picked up the digital alarm clock, removed the hidden camera casing, and immediately plugged the device directly into my laptop. The video file loaded onto my screen. I pressed play and watched Beatrice strut proudly through the motel room, clearly admitting to every single facet of the 2-year federal conspiracy. The audio was flawless. The image was sharp. The arrogant sneer on her face was perfectly preserved in high-definition digital media. I picked up my prepaid cell phone and dialed Agent Reynolds at his direct Federal Bureau extension. He answered on the second ring. Agent Reynolds. I said, my voice completely stripped of the pathetic victim routine I had played just moments ago. I have a recorded statement you need to hear immediately. It details the exact forgery methods, the timeline of the offshore accounts, and names a direct co-conspirator who helped facilitate Julian's escape. Where are you? He asked, his tone shifting instantly into professional federal alert. I gave him the address of a secure 24-hour coffee shop located exactly halfway between my motel and the downtown federal building. I packed my laptop, the hidden camera, and the massive envelope of illegal cash into a simple black backpack. I drove through the dark, quiet streets of Seattle, feeling the heavy, oppressive weight of the last 15 years slowly begin to lift off my shoulders. Agent Reynolds was already sitting in a back booth when I arrived. He looked tired, nursing a black coffee. I sat down across from him, opened my laptop, and pressed play on the unedited video file. He sat in total silence, watching Beatrice Sterling gleefully boast about forging my signatures and hiding millions of dollars while I was on life support in an intensive care unit. I watched the muscle in Reynolds' jaw twitch as he listened to her claim that guilt was only for poor people. When the video finally ended, Reynolds slowly closed my laptop screen. He looked at me with an expression of profound respect. In his line of work, he dealt with countless victims who crumbled under the weight of financial destruction. He rarely encountered a victim who systematically and clinically trapped their abusers on tape. "This is an absolute goldmine, Chloe," he said quietly, tapping his fingers against the table. "We have enough evidence right here to issue an immediate federal indictment against Beatrice Sterling for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and money laundering. We can raid the house tonight and pull her out in handcuffs." "No," I said quickly, my voice sharp and decisive. Reynolds frowned, confused. "Why wait? She just handed us the entire criminal enterprise on a silver platter. We can end this right now." I looked at the federal agent, a calm, cold determination settling deeply into my bones. The criminal case was fully secured. Julian and Beatrice were both going to face decades in federal prison for their crimes against the government and their crimes against me. But they were still actively planning to host a lavish dinner party on Friday night to celebrate their absolute victory over the simple girl from the wrong side of the tracks. Because I have one final piece of legal business to execute, I told Reynolds, keeping my voice perfectly steady. Beatrice and Julian think they have won the war. They think they hold all the cards. They think they own the kingdom. I need you to wait exactly 48 hours before you move in with the arrest warrants. I need them to be surrounded by their wealthy, arrogant friends when the truth finally comes out. Reynolds studied my face for a long time, recognizing the absolute finality in my eyes. He slowly nodded his head, agreeing to the timeline. The trap was now fully armed and heavily supported by the federal government. But before the spectacular Friday night dinner party, I had to take a quick trip back to my lawyer, Robert Hayes. Julian had unknowingly placed the deed to the $3.4 million Seattle mansion into the shell company that I legally controlled. I had to legally transfer the entire estate into my personal name before the dinner guests arrived. I was not just going to send my abusers to federal prison. I was going to legally evict them from the very house they thought they owned. The mediation took place on a dreary Wednesday morning in a high-rise office building downtown. The conference room was exactly the kind of intimidating, sterile space designed to make ordinary people feel incredibly small. It featured a massive glass table, cold leather chairs, and sweeping views of the gray Seattle skyline. I arrived early, accompanied by my attorney, Robert Hayes. I deliberately wore the same faded jeans and oversized fleece jacket I had been wearing when my mother-in-law locked me out of my own home. I left my hair unstyled and wore absolutely no makeup. To anyone walking into that room, I looked exactly like a completely broken, terrified woman standing on the absolute edge of total ruin. That was precisely the illusion I needed to project. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass doors swung open and my husband Julian walked in. He did not look like a man who was actively hiding from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He did not look like a man who had stolen millions of dollars. He strode into the room wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a gold luxury watch gleaming on his wrist. He radiated the slick, polished confidence of a highly successful real estate developer who firmly believed he was completely untouchable. His high-priced corporate attorney, a man named Richard Caldwell, walked right beside him, carrying a thick leather briefcase. Julian did not even look at me when he took his seat on the opposite side of the long glass table. He simply unbuttoned his suit jacket, sat back and checked his phone with an air of profound boredom. He was projecting an image of the deeply wounded, righteous husband who was graciously taking time out of his busy schedule to deal with a treacherous criminal wife. It took every single ounce of my professional self-control as a certified public accountant not to leap across the table and wrap my hands around his throat. I had built the very wealth that paid for the expensive suit he was wearing. I had sacrificed my own career to build his empire. And now he was sitting there treating me like a minor inconvenience he was about to permanently swat away. The court-appointed mediator, an older man with silver hair and a gentle voice, officially opened the session. He stated that the goal of this emergency meeting was to find an equitable resolution to the dissolution of our marriage, considering the extraordinary criminal allegations currently hanging over the estate. Caldwell Julian's arrogant attorney immediately took control of the conversation. He did not waste any time with pleasantries. He opened his leather briefcase and slid a single thin document across the glass table toward Robert and me. My client is willing to be incredibly generous, considering the severe trauma and devastating public embarrassment your client has inflicted upon this family, Caldwell said, his voice dripping with pure condescension. We are offering a one-time lump sum settlement of $50,000. In exchange, Chloe will sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. She will immediately waive any and all claims to the marital estate, including the primary residence in the suburbs. And most importantly, she will fully accept the plea deal currently being drafted by the federal prosecutors, taking absolute solitary responsibility for the wire fraud and money laundering charges involving her shell company. I stared down at the piece of paper. $50,000. That was all my 10 years of absolute blind devotion was worth to him. It was a perfectly calculated insult. It was enough money to maybe secure a cheap apartment and pay a public defender, but it was absolute pennies compared to the $24 million real estate portfolio I had personally managed and grown for his firm. Julian wanted me to go to a federal penitentiary for 2 decades, so he could walk away with millions of dollars in stolen offshore capital, and he actually expected me to thank him for the privilege. I looked up from the document and finally met Julian's eyes across the table. He was staring at me with a cold, blank expression. There was absolutely no love left in his gaze. There was no remorse for framing me. He simply viewed me as a liability that he had successfully neutralized. I took a sharp, jagged breath and immediately forced my hands to start trembling. I channeled every single ounce of the genuine terror I had felt in the back of the FBI transport vehicle and brought it right to the surface. I let my breathing hitch. I let hot, desperate tears well up in my eyes and spill over my pale cheeks. I buried my face in my hands, allowing my shoulders to shake violently. I put on the absolute performance of a lifetime. I do not want to go to prison, I sobbed, my voice cracking perfectly in the quiet room. Please, Julian. You know I do not belong in a federal cell. I am terrified. I have absolutely nothing left. Your mother completely emptied the bank accounts. She threw my clothes onto the porch in garbage bags. I am sleeping in a terrible rundown motel. I'm so deeply sorry for everything. I just want this massive nightmare to end. Across the table, Julian visibly relaxed. The rigid tension in his posture melted away, replaced by a deeply satisfied, arrogant smirk. He glanced over at his attorney with a look of pure triumph. He truly believed he had completely broken my spirit. He believed the simple girl from the blue-collar neighborhood had finally realized she was hopelessly outmatched by his vast wealth and superior intellect. Robert Hayes played his part flawlessly. My ruthless bulldog attorney sighed heavily, running a hand over his face like a deeply defeated public defender who knew his client had absolutely no other options. He reached out and gently patted my shaking shoulder. My client is in a highly vulnerable and deeply precarious legal position, Caldwell Robert said, keeping his tone subdued and hesitant. The federal authorities are threatening a massive 20-year sentence. She understands that she does not have the financial resources to fight a protracted legal battle against your client or the federal government. We are prepared to accept the terms of the settlement. She will sign the divorce papers. She will sign the non-disclosure agreement. And she will officially notify the federal prosecutors tomorrow morning that she intends to take full responsibility for the financial crimes. Caldwell smiled broadly, snapping his expensive pen. Excellent, he said efficiently. I will have the final binding documents printed and ready for signature by tomorrow afternoon. We can conclude this unfortunate business immediately. I slowly lifted my tear-stained face from my hands. I wiped my wet cheeks with the sleeve of my oversized fleece jacket, looking directly at Julian with wide, pathetic eyes. I will sign everything I said. My voice a fragile whisper. I will take the absolute blame. I will completely walk away from the house and the business. But I have one single condition. Julian raised an eyebrow, his smirk faltering just slightly. You are in absolutely no position to make conditions, Chloe, he said, his voice hard and dismissive. It is not about money, I pleaded quickly, leaning forward and clasping my trembling hands together on the glass table. I just want closure. I gave 10 years of my life to our family, Julian. I helped raise Lucas. I managed your home. I know I lost my way, but I cannot just disappear into a federal prison from a dirty motel room. I want to sign the final documents at the house. Caldwell immediately shook his head. Absolutely not. There is an active restraining order preventing you from stepping foot on the property. My client is not going to violate a court order just to indulge your emotional theatrics. But I kept my eyes locked entirely on Julian, ignoring his attorney completely. I knew exactly how to manipulate my husband's colossal narcissistic ego. Please, Julian, I begged, letting another tear slide down my cheek. Tomorrow is Friday. I know your mother and Brenda are hosting the big dinner party with the church elders. I know everyone in our social circle is going to be there. I want to walk into that house one last time. I want to look your mother and your friends in the eye and officially take responsibility for what I did to your pristine family name. I want to publicly apologize to you in front of everyone who matters. And I want to go up to the master bedroom and retrieve my late grandmother's simple silver necklace. I left it in my jewelry box when the federal agents dragged me away. It is virtually worthless, but it is the only piece of my real family I have left. Let me collect my necklace, sign the papers in front of your witnesses, and then I swear to God you will never see my face ever again. I watched the gears turning violently in Julian's arrogant mind. The absolute brilliance of his narcissism was that he could never resist an opportunity to be worshipped as a martyr. If I signed the papers in a quiet, sterile downtown law office, he would simply get the legal victory. But if I walked into our $3.4 million estate right in the middle of a lavish dinner party, surrounded by all the wealthy, influential people in his elite social circle, and publicly groveled at his feet, confessing to federal crimes and begging for his forgiveness that would give him the ultimate social victory. He would be permanently cemented as the tragic noble hero who survived his wicked criminal wife. It was an absolute masterstroke for his public reputation. Julian held up his hand, silencing his attorney who was preparing to object again. He leaned forward, resting his tailored elbows on the glass table, looking at me with an expression of pure, cruel superiority. "You really want to humiliate yourself in front of my entire congregation, Chloe?" he asked, a dark, terrible amusement dancing in his eyes. "You want to walk into my dining room and admit to everyone that you are nothing but a common thief?" "Yes," I whispered, bowing my head in utter submission. "I owe you that much for ruining your life. I just want my grandmother's necklace." Julian smiled. It was a cold, triumphant, terrifying smile. He turned to his attorney. "Draft an emergency 24-hour waiver for the restraining order Caldwell. Allow her access to the primary residence between 7 and 8 in the evening this Friday. She can come collect her cheap little necklace, sign her life away, and give my mother the public apology she deeply deserves." Caldwell frowned, clearly unhappy with the theatrical arrangement, but he nodded, writing down the instructions. "Very well. We will execute the signatures at the estate on Friday evening." The mediator officially closed the session. Julian stood up, buttoned his bespoke suit jacket, and walked out of the conference room without sparing me another single glance. He strutted out the glass doors, looking like a conquering king returning to his rightful throne. He thought he had just successfully orchestrated the perfect clean escape. He thought he had entirely crushed the simple girl who used to balance his spreadsheets. The heavy glass doors clicked shut, leaving Robert and me completely alone in the quiet conference room. The absolute moment Julian's shadow disappeared from the hallway, my entire posture instantly transformed. My slumped shoulders straightened immediately. My shaking hands stopped completely. I reached up and smoothly wiped the fake tears from my face, my expression hardening into cold, sharp, unyielding granite. Robert Hayes looked at me from across the table, a slow, deeply impressed smile spreading across his weathered face. "You missed your true calling in Hollywood, Chloe," he said quietly. "That was one of the most brilliant, absolute manipulations of a hostile narcissist I have ever witnessed in my entire legal career." He completely swallowed the hook. "I am a certified public accountant," I replied, my voice dropping back into its normal, steady, authoritative tone. "I deal with arrogant men who think they can hide their massive mistakes all day long." He is so utterly obsessed with protecting his public image and humiliating me that he is entirely blind to his own exposure. Robert reached down to the floor and picked up his worn leather briefcase. He clicked the brass locks open and pulled out a completely different manila folder. This folder did not contain a pathetic $50,000 divorce settlement. This folder contained the absolute financial death warrant for Julian Sterling. He slid a pristine, heavy legal document across the glass table. It was a formal corporate deed transfer. I looked down at the crisp black text. The document explicitly authorized the immediate transfer of the sprawling $3.4 million Seattle estate completely out of the holdings of the fraudulent shell company known as Apex Holdings. The designated receiving party for the massive property was me, Chloe Sterling, as a sole individual owner. Julian firmly believed he was inviting a broken, terrified criminal into his beautiful home to publicly beg for mercy. He had absolutely no idea that in his desperate attempt to frame me for tax evasion, he had legally assigned me as the total reigning authority over every single asset his shell company owned. I did not just have the right to sign this document. I had the absolute, unquestionable fiduciary power to execute the transfer. "We have exactly 48 hours before that dinner party begins." Robert said, his tone turning deadly serious. "I need your signature on this transfer deed right now. We will electronically file this with the county clerk's office the moment they open tomorrow morning. It typically takes exactly 24 hours for the bureaucratic system to fully process and formally stamp the title change into the permanent public record." I picked up the heavy, expensive pen Robert offered me. I did not hesitate. I did not shake. My hand was perfectly firm as I signed my name with the exact same fluid motion I had used to save Julian's company from ruin 1,000 times before. The ticking clock officially began. Julian was currently planning the menu for his grand victory dinner. Beatrice and Brenda were likely selecting their most expensive dresses, eager to watch me fall to my knees in front of their church friends. They were preparing a stage for my absolute destruction. But what they did not know, what they could not possibly comprehend, was that the moment the clock struck midnight on Thursday, the ground they were standing on would legally cease to belong to them. They were about to host a lavish celebration in a kingdom that had already fallen. I sat in the worn leather guest chair in Robert Hayes' downtown office, watching the heavy Seattle rain lash against the large plate glass windows. It was exactly 24 hours before the grand Friday night dinner party. 24 hours before I was scheduled to walk into my former home, fall to my knees, and publicly sign away my entire life in front of my husband Julian and his wealthy, arrogant congregation. But I was not in Robert's office to practice my apologies. I was there to completely pull the floor out from under them. Robert sat across from me, his expression deadly serious. He placed a single crisp document onto the center of his cluttered wooden desk. It was a formal corporate warranty deed. I stared down at the heavy black text printed on the bright white paper. This single sheet of paper represented the absolute pinnacle of Julian's colossal narcissistic mistake. To completely shield his immense wealth from federal tax auditors, and to ensure I would take the absolute full blame for his massive criminal enterprise, Julian had formally transferred the ownership of our sprawling $3.4 million suburban estate directly into the holdings of a shell company called Apex Holdings. He had then legally registered me as the sole acting chief executive officer of that specific company. He assumed I was just a naive, devoted housewife who would never bother to read the complex legal paperwork he asked me to electronically sign. He fundamentally underestimated my professional training as a certified public accountant. And because he was so completely blinded by his own toxic hubris, he completely failed to realize the ultimate legal reality of his elaborate setup. As the legally documented sole executive of Apex Holdings, I possess the absolute unilateral fiduciary authority to buy, sell, or transfer any asset belonging to that company. Julian did not own the mansion. His cruel mother, Beatrice, did not own it. His entitled sister, Brenda, did not own it. The company owned it. And I controlled the company. Robert smoothed his hand over the document. "This is it, Chloe," he said, his voice low and steady. "The moment your signature goes on this line, we are formally transferring the entire estate out of the corporate shell and directly into your sole personal ownership. But you need to understand the absolute incredible risk we are taking right now. We are executing this transfer electronically through the King County Public Recording System. The bureaucratic system is notoriously slow and highly unpredictable. It goes into a digital queue. If the county clerk flags this transaction for a manual review, it could take several days to clear." I felt a cold, sharp knot of pure anxiety form tightly in my stomach. "What happens if it takes days?" I asked. "If it takes days, the transaction will remain pending in the public registry," Robert explained, leaning forward. "Julian still has high-priced corporate lawyers actively monitoring the legal status of his various shell companies. If his legal team runs a routine asset check tomorrow morning and sees a pending property transfer, they will immediately alert him. Julian will instantly realize that you have discovered his massive fatal loophole. He will know that the pathetic broken victim routine was a complete charade. If that happens, he will instantly drain the remaining millions from his offshore accounts, scatter the funds into untraceable digital currency, and vanish permanently, before the Federal Bureau of Investigation can even secure a proper warrant. We will lose the money. We will lose the criminal conviction, and you will be left holding the bag for the entire federal fraud case." The stakes were impossibly high. My absolute freedom and my entire future rested completely on this single legal maneuver slipping through the county system unnoticed before the dinner party tomorrow night. "We have to do it," I said, my voice surprisingly firm despite the terror gripping my chest. "He wants me to sign the fake divorce papers tomorrow night. I need the house in my name before I walk through those double doors. Robert nodded slowly. He uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen and handed it to me. Then we execute the trap. I took the pen. The metal felt cool and heavy in my trembling fingers. I looked down at the signature line. I thought about the 10 long years I had spent scrubbing those hardwood floors, polishing the marble countertops, and meticulously balancing the household budgets so Julian could pretend to be a self-made millionaire. I thought about Beatrice constantly criticizing my cooking and cropping me out of family photographs in the living room. I thought about the federal agents throwing me to the ground in my pajamas while Julian slipped away into the night like a coward. I pressed the tip of the pen to the paper and signed my name with absolute perfect clarity. Robert immediately took the document, placed it into his high-speed desktop scanner, and uploaded the digital file directly into the King County Official Property Recording Portal. He clicked the final submission button. The screen displayed a generic gray loading circle, and then a simple message appeared. Document submitted for processing. Now, Robert said, leaning back in his chair and exhaling a long breath. We wait. The wait was sheer psychological torture. I left Robert's office and drove my battered sedan back to the decaying industrial motel where I had been staying. I sat on the edge of the sagging floral mattress, staring blindly at the faded, peeling wallpaper. Every single minute felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I kept checking my cell phone, desperately hoping to see a text message from Robert confirming the deed had cleared. But my screen remained dark and silent. At exactly 7 in the evening, my phone finally buzzed. My heart leaped into my throat and I scrambled to grab it. But it was not Robert. The incoming text message was from Julian's sister, Brenda. I opened the message and read the words carefully. The sheer cruel entitlement of her text made my blood run entirely cold. Just finalized the luxury catering for tomorrow night, Brenda wrote. We ordered the Chilean sea bass and the expensive truffles. Try not to eat before you come over. We all know you cannot afford decent food right now, living in whatever disgusting ditch you crawled into. I stared at the glowing screen. Brenda had never earned a single paycheck in her life. Her entire luxurious existence was completely funded by the very company I had managed and grown. And yet she delighted in kicking me when she firmly believed I was completely destroyed. A second message popped up immediately after the first. Mother says to make sure your cheap shoes are totally clean before you step inside the house tomorrow. We just had the hardwood floors professionally polished for the church guests. Do not make a muddy mess when you come to sign the papers and apologize to Julian. We want to get you out of our beautiful home as quickly as possible. Our beautiful home. I gripped the phone tightly, my knuckles turning completely white. The urge to text her back and tell her exactly what I had done was almost physically overwhelming. I wanted to scream through the digital connection that she was polishing floors that currently belonged to me. I wanted to tell her that her arrogant, untouchable brother had literally handed me the keys to the castle because he thought I was too stupid to understand a corporate ledger. But I took a deep, jagged breath and violently forced my anger down. I had to maintain the illusion of total defeat. I had to keep them completely blinded by their own massive egos. I carefully typed my reply, ensuring it sounded exactly like the broken, terrified woman they expected. I will make sure my shoes are clean. I will be there at 7. I am so sorry for everything. Brenda did not reply. She had gotten the submissive, pathetic response she wanted, and she was likely showing it to Beatrice right now, laughing at my complete humiliation. The hours dragged on with agonizing, excruciating slowness. Outside the motel window, the dark Seattle sky poured relentless, heavy rain onto the cracked asphalt parking lot. 9 o'clock passed. 10 o'clock passed. 11 o'clock came and went with absolute agonizing silence. I paced the narrow strip of stained carpet in my cheap room, wearing a visible path into the floor fibers. My mind raced with 1,000 terrifying scenarios. What if the county clerk flagged the transaction? What if Julian's lawyers were awake running late-night asset checks? What if the Federal Bureau of Investigation moved in too early and ruined the entire carefully constructed timeline? By 11:30, my stomach was twisted into tight, painful knots. I could not breathe properly. The stale cigarette smoke embedded in the motel walls felt suffocating. I picked up my phone and called Robert. He answered immediately, clearly sitting at his desk and staring at the exact same portal. "Nothing yet," Robert said, his voice carrying a tight, underlying edge of stress. "The system processes the final daily batch of property transfers right at midnight. If the automated system does not clear the deed by 12 o'clock, it means a human clerk has pulled the file for a manual fraud review. If it goes to manual review, it will not clear until Monday. And Julian will absolutely know by tomorrow morning." My knees felt completely weak. I sat down heavily on the edge of the mattress. "We have 30 minutes, I whispered. 30 minutes, Robert confirmed. "Keep your phone off silent. I will call you the exact second the status changes." I hung up the phone and stared at the bright red digital numbers on the cheap motel alarm clock. 11:35, 11:40, 11:45. I felt like I was standing on the absolute edge of a massive sheer cliff, completely blindfolded, waiting for a sudden gust of wind to either push me to my death or carry me to safety. I thought about the 10 years I had lost. I thought about the sheer terror of the FBI raid. I thought about Beatrice smirking at me on the front porch holding her warm coffee while I shivered in the freezing rain. I prayed to whoever was listening. I begged for the system to simply process the paperwork. 11:50, 11:55, 11:58. The silence in the motel room was completely absolute, deafening and heavy. I did not blink. I did not move. I just watched the red numbers shift with agonizing slowness. 11:59. The digital clock clicked over to exactly 12 midnight. Thursday ended, and Friday officially began. For 3 painfully long seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The room remained dark and silent. A heavy sinking wave of total despair began to wash over my chest. The system had failed. The document was flagged. Julian was going to discover the trap, and I was going to spend 20 years in a federal prison. And then my cell phone lit up the dark room with a bright, blinding glow. A loud, sharp notification chime pierced the quiet silence. It was an incoming call from Robert Hayes. I grabbed the phone, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped the device onto the floor. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Robert," I gasped, my voice cracking completely. There was a brief, heavy pause on the other end of the line, and then I heard the sound of Robert letting out a long, deep, genuine laugh of pure, absolute victory. "It is done, Chloe," Robert said, his voice ringing with incredible, triumphant satisfaction. "The county clerk automated system just issued the final digital stamp. The transaction is completely cleared. The property transfer is permanently recorded in the public registry." I could not process the words immediately. My brain simply refused to accept the reality. "It is recorded," I asked, tears suddenly springing to my eyes, blurring the dark room. "It is completely legally irrevocable," Robert confirmed firmly. "Apex Holdings no longer owns the property. You own it. You are the sole legal documented owner of the estate. Julian has absolutely zero claim to the land, the structure, or the assets inside it. He handed you the weapon, and you just successfully pulled the trigger." I let out a sound that was half sob and half laugh. The overwhelming, crushing tension that had been strangling me for days instantly evaporated, leaving me feeling completely weightless. I opened my laptop with trembling fingers and navigated directly to the King County Public Property Tax Portal. I typed in the address of the sprawling $3.4 million suburban estate. The website loaded, slowly buffering for a few agonizing seconds, and then the official property record populated on my screen. I stared at the data table. The previous owner was listed as Apex Holdings, LLC. The current legally registered owner, displayed in bold black text, was Chloe Sterling. I reached out and touched the screen, running my fingers over my own name. The sheer incredible magnitude of what I had just accomplished washed over me. I had used my professional knowledge to completely turn the tables on a highly sophisticated criminal operation. I had legally, lawfully, and brilliantly stolen my own house right back from the arrogant monsters who had tried to completely destroy my life. "Get some sleep tonight," Chloe Roberts said gently through the phone. "Tomorrow is going to be a very big day." The federal agents have reviewed the hidden camera footage of Beatrice confessing to the entire forgery operation. The FBI is fully prepared to execute the arrest warrants exactly when we give them the signal. Tomorrow night, we are going to walk into that dinner party and completely dismantle their entire world. I thanked Robert and hung up the phone. I closed the laptop and walked over to the small, grimy window of the motel room. I pulled back the faded curtain and looked out into the dark, rainy night, looking toward the affluent, wealthy suburbs miles away. I pictured the massive, immaculate house sitting quietly in the dark. I pictured Julian sleeping peacefully in the luxurious master bedroom, completely convinced of his own absolute superiority. I pictured Beatrice and Brenda resting easily, firmly believing they had entirely defeated me. They were going to wake up tomorrow morning and spend the entire day preparing an extravagant, lavish dinner party. They were going to polish my hardwood floors. They were going to arrange expensive flowers on my dining room table. They were going to invite all of their wealthy, arrogant friends into my living room to celebrate my complete destruction. They had absolutely no idea that they were currently sleeping in a house they did not own. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet legally belonged to the very woman they had thrown out like garbage. The legal snare was now pulled completely and irrevocably tight around their necks. They wanted a dramatic public performance. They wanted me to walk through the front doors and beg for mercy in front of their entire congregation. I smiled softly to myself, a cold, sharp smile that finally matched the quiet, dangerous strength I had found in the darkness. I was going to attend their beautiful dinner party, and I was going to serve them absolute, unmitigated justice. The Friday night air in Seattle was heavy with a cold, relentless drizzle. I turned my rusted, reliable sedan onto the private, pristine street of my former neighborhood. The massive oak trees I had personally helped plant a decade ago stood like silent sentinels in the dark. As I approached the sprawling $3.4 million estate, my headlights swept across a driveway packed entirely with luxury vehicles. There were sleek silver Mercedes sedans, pristine black Range Rovers, and low-slung Porsche sports cars. These belonged to Julian's incredibly wealthy social circle. These were the elite church elders, the corporate board members, and the high society wives who had gladly eaten my cooking and drank my expensive wine for 10 years. Tonight they were all gathered in my formal dining room to celebrate my absolute destruction. I parked my beat-up car at the very end of the street, far behind the glittering lineup of wealth. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet darkness of the cold vehicle. I looked down at my clothes. I was wearing the same faded college sweatshirt and the worn-out denim jeans that Beatrice had shoved into black plastic garbage bags just a few days ago. My hair was pulled back into a simple, messy knot. I wore absolutely no makeup. I had spent the last 48 hours practically living in a filthy, rundown motel room, and I looked exactly like a completely broken, defeated woman who had nothing left to lose. That was precisely the image they desperately wanted to see. They wanted a pathetic criminal crawling back to beg for scraps. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs. The fear that had been paralyzing me was completely gone. The panic of the federal raid, the humiliation of the interrogation room, the sheer agony of Julian draining my bank accounts to zero, it had all completely evaporated. In its place was a freezing, absolute resolve. I opened my car door and stepped out into the rain. I walked up the long, sweeping aggregate driveway. I could hear the faint, elegant sounds of a string quartet playing inside the house. I could smell the rich, decadent aroma of roasted Chilean sea bass and expensive truffle oil wafting from the professional catering kitchen. Julian had spared absolutely no expense for his grand victory party. He was playing the role of the deeply wounded righteous husband perfectly. He wanted his entire congregation to watch him graciously offer a tiny $50,000 settlement to the wicked woman who had supposedly tried to ruin his pristine family name. I reached the massive custom front doors and pressed the heavy brass doorbell. A few moments later, the door swung open. Julian's sister Brenda stood in the grand foyer wearing a stunning emerald green cocktail dress and holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne. Her eyes swept over my wet, faded clothes, and her face instantly twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. "You actually showed up looking like that," Brenda sneered, her voice loud enough for the guests in the adjacent formal living room to hear. "Wipe your cheap shoes on the mat outside, Chloe. We just had the imported mahogany floors professionally polished this afternoon, and we do not want your filthy mess ruining our beautiful home." I kept my head bowed, completely submissive. "I am sorry, Brenda," I whispered softly, playing the role of the completely shattered victim flawlessly. "I will be very careful." She rolled her eyes and stepped back, allowing me to enter the massive foyer. The warmth of the house washed over my damp clothes. The spectacular crystal chandelier I had spent months sourcing from Italy glowed brilliantly above us. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor as Brenda led me through the wide, arched hallway toward the formal dining room. The dining room was a magnificent space featuring a massive custom-built mahogany table that seated 20 people. The room was absolutely packed with Julian's pretentious friends. I recognized Elder Thomas from the church board standing near the fireplace swirling a glass of scotch. I saw Mrs. Gable, a prominent local socialite wearing a thick diamond necklace. The moment I walked into the room, every single conversation stopped dead. The string quartet music seemed to echo loudly in the sudden suffocating silence. Dozens of highly judgmental eyes stared at me, taking in my wet hair and my cheap, faded clothes. I could feel their heavy, crushing condemnation. They had all been told the exact same lie. They all believed I was a dangerous, unstable criminal who had secretly funneled millions of dollars into illegal offshore accounts. Sitting at the very head of the long mahogany table, perfectly framed by the roaring stone fireplace, was Julian. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His hair was perfectly styled. He looked like a king holding court in his absolute prime. Standing directly to his right, resting her hand proudly on his shoulder, was his mother, Beatrice. She wore a tailored cream-colored dress, dripping with expensive pearls. They looked at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. There was absolutely no trace of guilt in Julian's eyes. There was no remorse for leaving me intubated in a hospital bed 2 years ago while he forged my signature to create a massive federal tax fraud syndicate. He was completely blinded by his own massive toxic hubris. Julian gestured lazily to the empty space at the opposite end of the long table. "Step forward, Chloe," he commanded, his voice echoing with deep theatrical authority. The entire room watched in absolute silence as I slowly walked the length of the expensive Persian rug. I stopped at the end of the table, keeping my shoulders slumped and my hands clasped nervously in front of my waist. Resting on the polished wood directly in front of me was a thick legal document bound in a dark blue cover. Sitting neatly on top of the paper was a heavy gold fountain pen. "You understand why we are all here tonight, Chloe," Julian said, his tone dripping with fake righteous sorrow. "You have committed grave, unforgivable sins against this family and against the law. You tried to steal our generational wealth. You abused my absolute blind trust. But because I am a man of deep faith, I am choosing grace over vengeance." Elder Thomas nodded solemnly from the corner of the room, softly murmuring his approval. Julian pointed at the blue folder. "That document is your final divorce settlement and your full federal confession. You will take the $50,000 we have generously offered you. You will sign your name accepting full solitary responsibility for the criminal shell company known as Apex Holdings. You will completely clear my name with the federal authorities, and then you will leave this state permanently. If you sign this right now, we will allow you to go upstairs, collect your cheap little grandmother's necklace, and walk out the front door. If you refuse, my attorneys will immediately release you to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and you will spend the next 20 years rotting in a concrete cell." I looked down at the heavy gold pen. My fingers trembled visibly. I let hot, desperate tears well up in my eyes and spill over my pale cheeks. I looked around the room at the wealthy, judgmental faces staring at me. I looked at Brenda, who was openly smirking, taking a sip of her champagne. I looked at Julian, who was sitting back in his expensive leather dining chair, waiting for his ultimate public triumph. I slowly reached out and picked up the gold pen. The metal felt cold against my skin. I removed the cap with a soft click. At the head of the long dining table, Beatrice suddenly took a step forward. She could not resist the absolute golden opportunity to twist the knife one final time. She loved holding court. She loved proving her total superiority over the blue-collar girl her son had mistakenly married 10 years ago. Beatrice raised her crystal wine glass high in the air, catching the light of the spectacular chandelier. She looked me up and down, taking in my wet, faded college sweatshirt and my cheap denim jeans. We tried to warn him. Beatrice announced, her voice ringing out clearly across the silent dining room. We told him you were nothing but a common, greedy little thief from the very beginning. You never belonged in this house. You never belonged in our respectable circles. You were just a highly convenient idiot for my son. She took a slow, dramatic sip of her expensive red wine, lowering the crystal glass with a sharp, terrifying sneer. Leaving you was his best choice, she declared proudly. A few of the high society guests murmured their agreement. Julian smiled a cold, dark smile of absolute victory. I stood at the end of the long mahogany table, holding the heavy gold pen. I let Beatrice's cruel, humiliating words hang in the warm air of the dining room. I let the absolute finality of their arrogance completely fill the space. I looked down at the bogus divorce settlement that was designed to send me to a federal penitentiary and shield Julian from his massive, devastating crimes. And then completely and suddenly I stopped crying. I stood up perfectly straight. I pulled my shoulders back. I wiped the fake tears from my cheeks with a smooth, deliberate motion. I looked directly across the length of the long table, locking my eyes entirely on Julian. The pathetic, terrified, broken victim routine vanished from my face, instantly replaced by a mask of cold, sharp, unyielding granite. I slowly capped the heavy gold pen. The sharp metallic click echoed like a gunshot in the completely silent room. I am not signing anything, Julian, I said, my voice dropping into a calm, freezing, absolute authority. Julian frowned, his arrogant smile faltering slightly. What did you just say? He demanded, his tone flashing with sudden dark anger. Pick up the pen, Chloe. You do not have a choice. I placed the pen down on the polished wood and took one deliberate step back from the table. Right on absolute perfect cue, the massive custom oak doors of the formal dining room swung violently open. The heavy thud of leather boots hitting the imported hardwood floors made every single guest in the room jump in surprise. Attorney Robert Hayes strode into the dining room. He did not wear a tuxedo. He wore his standard wrinkled gray suit and carried a battered leather briefcase. He walked with the heavy, ruthless momentum of a seasoned legal bulldog who absolutely lived to destroy arrogant white-collar criminals. He completely ignored the gasps of the wealthy church elders and the shocked stares of the high society wives. He marched straight past Brenda, who dropped her crystal champagne flute, shattering it across the pristine floor. Robert stopped directly next to me at the end of the long mahogany table. He looked across the expensive catering spread, locking his cold, highly calculated eyes directly on Julian and Beatrice. Who the hell are you? Julian shouted, standing up aggressively from his leather chair. You are trespassing on private property. Get out of my house right now before I call the police. Robert did not blink. He reached down, picked up Julian's bogus $50,000 divorce settlement, and casually tossed it directly into a nearby decorative trash can. It landed with a soft, pathetic thud. Then Robert opened his battered leather briefcase. He pulled out a single heavy legal document printed on bright white paper and stamped with a massive blue official county seal. Robert placed the document flat on the polished mahogany wood and slid it firmly down the entire length of the 20-foot table. The heavy paper glided smoothly across the expensive surface, stopping exactly inches from Julian's fingertips. I am Robert Hayes. Robert announced, his voice booming with deep, uncompromising legal authority. I represent Chloe Sterling, and I highly suggest you read the public property record I just handed you, Julian. Julian stared down at the crisp white paper. Beatrice leaned over his shoulder, her face twisting with deep, angry confusion. "What is this garbage?" she demanded. Robert stood perfectly still, straightening his gray suit jacket. He looked directly at Julian, delivering the absolute fatal blow with flawless, devastating precision. "The house transferred to her at midnight," Robert said clearly. The entire dining room plunged into an absolute suffocating vacuum of silence. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. I watched Julian's eyes dart frantically down to the heavy stamped document. He read the bold black text. He read the official digital timestamps from the King County Public Recording Office. He read the name of the shell company he had used to hide his offshore millions. Apex Holdings, LLC. And then he read the legally documented name of the sole chief executive officer who possessed absolute unquestionable fiduciary authority over every single asset that company owned. Chloe Sterling. To shield his massive wealth from the Internal Revenue Service, and to perfectly frame me for federal tax evasion, Julian had legally transferred the deed of this sprawling $3.4 million estate completely out of his own personal name. He had formally deeded the mansion directly into the ownership of Apex Holdings. He assumed I was too uneducated to ever read the complex corporate bylaws. He forgot I was a licensed, certified public accountant. He had locked me out of the front door without realizing he had given me the literal legal keys to his entire kingdom. I watched the exact terrifying moment the horrifying reality crashed completely down upon Julian. The color violently and instantly drained entirely from Beatrice's face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. Her mouth opened in absolute silent horror. Brenda let out a small, pathetic gasp from the hallway, finally realizing that the magnificent hardwood floors she had just polished no longer belonged to her family. Julian's hands began to shake uncontrollably. The slick, polished confidence of the untouchable real estate developer completely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. His chest heaved as he frantically read the county stamp again and again, desperately searching for a loophole that did not exist. The simple girl from the wrong side of the tracks had just legally, lawfully, and brilliantly stolen his $3.4 million mansion right out from under his feet. "You," Julian choked out, a strangled, terrifying sound escaping his throat. "You stole my house." "I did not steal anything, Julian," I said, my voice ringing with pure, cold vindication across the silent room. "You transferred the property to Apex Holdings to hide from the federal government. I am the legal documented CEO of Apex Holdings. I simply moved corporate assets into my personal portfolio. It is called forensic accounting. You should have hired a better CPA." Julian completely lost his mind. A visceral, animalistic scream ripped from his lungs. The absolute sheer magnitude of his toxic hubris collapsing back onto him caused his entire psyche to violently snap. He grabbed the heavy mahogany dining chair he had been sitting in and hurled it backward, crashing into the roaring stone fireplace. The church elders shouted in terror, scrambling backward. Mrs. Gable screamed, clutching her diamond necklace. Julian slammed his hands flat onto the polished table, his eyes wide and completely manic. He let out another guttural roar of pure, terrifying rage and lunged violently across the long mahogany table directly toward me. I watched Julian propel his entire body across the massive mahogany dining table. His face was completely distorted with a kind of monstrous, violent fury I had never seen before. Crystal wine glasses shattered as his knees crashed through the expensive catering spread. Plates of roasted Chilean sea bass and expensive truffles flew into the air, staining the pristine white tablecloth with grease and dark sauces. He was reaching directly for me. His hands curled into aggressive claws, desperate to physically silence the woman who had just dismantled his entire fraudulent empire. My attorney, Robert Hayes, did not flinch or back away. He simply stepped firmly in front of me, shielding my body with his own, prepared to take the physical blow to protect his client. I stood perfectly still behind him. I did not scream. I did not run. I just watched the man I had devotedly loved for 10 years completely unravel into a frantic, desperate animal. But Julian never reached me. Before his hands could even graze Robert, the heavy velvet curtains of the formal dining room were violently illuminated from the outside. Blinding flashes of brilliant red and piercing blue light painted the walls in frantic sweeping circles. The harsh spinning colors cut right through the soft golden glow of the crystal chandelier, reflecting off the terrified, shocked faces of the wealthy dinner guests. A split second later, a sound like thunder shook the entire solid foundation of the house. It was the distinct, deafening crash of a heavy steel battering ram, completely obliterating the temporary wooden front door the private contractors had installed just yesterday. Heavy tactical boots pounded loudly against the imported hardwood floors of the grand foyer. The elegant, soothing sounds of the string quartet had abruptly stopped, replaced entirely by the panicked, breathless shrieks of the high society wives. Federal agents clad in dark body armor flooded rapidly into the formal dining room. Their bright flashlights cut through the dim, romantic lighting, pinning Julian exactly where he was sprawled awkwardly across the ruined dining table. Agent Reynolds walked in right behind the tactical entry team. He looked absolutely commanding, entirely unbothered by the sheer wealth and social prestige gathered in the room. He pointed a steady, uncompromising finger directly at my husband. "Secure the primary suspect," Reynolds ordered, his voice slicing cleanly through the absolute chaos of the room. Two massive federal agents grabbed Julian by his custom-tailored shoulders and forcefully hauled him off the mahogany table. They slammed him face down onto the polished wood, knocking aside a heavy silver candelabra. Julian struggled wildly, twisting his body and shouting that they were making a massive mistake. He screamed that he was a highly respected real estate developer and a crucial pillar of the local community, but the agents completely ignored his arrogant protests and simply pulled his arms sharply behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly in the dining room, bringing a sudden terrifying silence to the entire crowd of church elders and wealthy socialites. "Julian Sterling," Agent Reynolds announced, his voice carrying clear and steady across the massive room. "You are under arrest for massive federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit money laundering and aggravated identity theft. Your desperate attempt to flee the country and systematically frame your wife for your illicit financial activities has completely failed. We have absolute, undeniable proof of your extensive corporate forgery. We have the unedited digital video confession from your own mother detailing exactly how you executed the offshore accounts and manipulated the federal tax codes. You are currently looking at a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the gathered crowd of elite guests. Elder Thomas dropped his glass of expensive scotch, letting it shatter completely on the hardwood floor. Mrs. Gable covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with sheer absolute horror as she stared at the man she had just been praising heavily moments ago. The entire room of pretentious, arrogant friends who had happily consumed Julian's lies and sneered at my cheap clothes were now watching their golden boy get treated exactly like a common street criminal. They were backing away from him, pressing themselves flat against the expensive wallpaper, desperate to legally and socially distance themselves from the catastrophic disgrace unfolding right in front of them. At the head of the ruined table, Beatrice finally broke. The cold, calculating matriarch who had spent a decade making me feel like absolute worthless garbage completely lost her mind. She let out a piercing, agonizing scream that tore violently through the dining room. She threw herself onto the floor, reaching out desperately toward her son as the federal agents yanked him up roughly to his feet. She screamed his name, her voice raw and completely hysterical. She demanded that they release him immediately, claiming he was a good man and a wealthy citizen. She insisted that they could not do this to the powerful Sterling family. She was crawling frantically on her hands and knees, her expensive cream-colored dress soaking up the spilled red wine and crushed truffles from the messy floor. She looked entirely pathetic, completely stripped of all her fake superiority and aristocratic pride. Julian did not even look at his crying mother. He twisted his head to look directly at me as the agents began to march him firmly toward the ruined front doors. His eyes were wide and filled with a terrifying mixture of absolute shock and pure, unadulterated hatred. He finally realized that the simple, quiet girl he had completely underestimated had systematically and flawlessly dismantled his entire life piece by piece. I met his furious gaze with perfectly calm, steady eyes. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the federal agents drag my abusive, deceitful husband out of my house and into the freezing Seattle rain. The heavy front doors closed behind them, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in their wake. Agent Reynolds turns to face the terrified, wealthy dinner guests who were still huddled against the walls. "The party is officially over," he stated flatly. "I highly suggest you all leave this property immediately, before we decide to start individually questioning anyone regarding their intimate knowledge of these severe federal crimes." That single threat was all it took. The wealthy church elders and the high society wives scrambled frantically toward the exit like rats escaping a sinking ship. They did not stop to say goodbye to Beatrice. They did not offer any words of comfort to Brenda, who was standing frozen against the wall, trembling violently like a frightened child. They simply grabbed their expensive coats and fled the scene, desperate to entirely protect their own fragile public reputations. Within 3 short minutes, the massive, elegant dining room was entirely empty except for Robert Hayes, Agent Reynolds, Beatrice, Brenda, and me. I stood at the end of the long mahogany table, looking at the incredible destruction of the evening. The expensive catered food was completely ruined. The imported wine was spilled everywhere. The fine crystal was shattered into hundreds of sharp pieces. It was a perfect physical representation of exactly what Julian and his toxic family had done to my life over the past decade. But I was no longer the broken, terrified victim shivering in the back of a police transport vehicle. I was the absolute legal owner of a $3.4 million estate, and I was finally in total absolute control of my own destiny. Beatrice was still sobbing heavily on the floor, her hands covering her face in total despair. Her perfect pearls were stained dark red with wine. Her carefully styled hair was an absolute mess. I slowly walked around the edge of the mahogany table, my footsteps echoing clearly and methodically in the quiet room. I stopped right in front of her, looking down at the exact woman who had locked me out of my own home and handed me a bogus $50,000 settlement just a few days ago. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, filled with a completely new and unfamiliar emotion. She was experiencing genuine, absolute fear. "You ruined him," Beatrice sobbed, choking heavily on her own tears. "You destroyed my beautiful son. You took absolutely everything from us." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely zero pity in my heart. "I did not ruin anyone, Beatrice," I said, my voice ringing with icy, unwavering authority. "Your son ruined himself the exact moment he decided to forge my signature and steal millions of dollars from the federal government. You ruined yourself the moment you decided to help him cover it up and then proudly brag about it to a hidden camera in a cheap motel room." I simply handed the undeniable truth over to the proper authorities. "You built your entire privileged life on a foundation of lies and abuse, and now that foundation has completely and permanently collapsed." Brenda finally found her voice trembling visibly against the far wall. She asked what was going to happen now, her voice weak and shaking. She looked completely ridiculous in her emerald green cocktail dress, standing in the aftermath of a massive federal raid. She stammered that they had nowhere else to go and that Julian owned the house and paid for everything. I slowly turned my gaze to Brenda. Robert Hayes stepped forward, resting his hands on the polished wood of the ruined table. "Julian does not own this house, Brenda," I said, keeping my tone completely flat and clinical. "The corporate shell company he illegally created owned this house. And as of midnight last night, the legal deed to this entire property was irrevocably transferred directly into my sole personal ownership. This is my house. You are currently standing in my dining room." Beatrice stopped crying instantly. She stared up at me, her mouth opening and closing as the horrifying reality finally set deeply into her mind. She whispered that I could not possibly do this. She stated that they had no money left because Julian had put everything into the frozen offshore accounts. I looked at the two women who had treated me like a disposable servant for 10 brutal years. I remembered the exact moment they tossed my cheap clothes onto the freezing porch in black plastic garbage bags. I remembered Brenda laughing at me, telling me to enjoy my time in a federal prison. I remembered Beatrice looking down her nose at me, telling me that leaving me was his best choice. "You have exactly 60 minutes," I told them, my voice as cold and hard as a Seattle winter storm. "You have exactly 1 hour to go upstairs, pack whatever personal clothes you can fit into your designer bags, and get completely out of my house. You will not take any expensive art. You will not take any jewelry purchased with marital funds. You will take only your basic clothing. When the hour is entirely up, Agent Reynolds and his team will escort you physically off my property. If you refuse to leave, or if you attempt to steal a single item from this estate, I will personally press formal charges and have you both arrested for criminal trespassing and theft." Brenda let out a loud, terrified sob, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Beatrice simply stared at me, her entire arrogant world completely and utterly annihilated. I did not wait for them to respond. I turned my back on them, walking calmly toward the grand foyer with Robert Hayes right beside me. The air in the house finally felt clean. The oppressive, toxic weight of the Sterling family had been permanently lifted from my shoulders. I had survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable, and I had emerged completely victorious. I was a 34-year-old woman who had just successfully reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her entire future. The simple girl from the wrong side of the tracks had finally taken the castle. If you are watching this right now, and you have ever been manipulated, discarded, or treated like you are entirely worthless by the people who are supposed to love you, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are so much stronger than the lies they tell you. Setting firm, absolute boundaries is never a betrayal. Walking away from toxic financial and emotional abuse is the most powerful thing you can do for yourself. You do not have to accept the blame for their terrible choices. You have the right to demand truth, and you have the absolute right to rebuild your life on your own terms. Do not ever let anyone make you feel small so they can feel big. Take back your power. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and let me know what city you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every single comment, and I love connecting with you all. Remember that you are completely worthy of a life built on respect and honesty. Take care of yourself because you truly deserve it. It has been exactly 6 months since that cold Friday night, when the flashing red and blue federal lights brilliantly illuminated the formal dining room windows of the house I used to call my home. I woke up this morning to the soft, gentle sound of rain tapping against the glass of my bedroom window. But for the first absolute time in a decade, the sound of a Seattle storm did not bring me any suffocating anxiety. I poured myself a simple cup of warm black coffee and sat on my new wooden porch, breathing in the crisp, clean Pacific Northwest air. The heavy, toxic, dark cloud that the Sterling family had kept wrapped tightly around my throat for 10 long years was completely and permanently gone. I am 28 years old, and I finally feel like my life is actually just beginning. The massive dust cloud from the federal investigation has finally settled into the ground, and the sheer absolute scale of the justice delivered has been nothing short of completely biblical. Let me tell you exactly what happened to the arrogant man who firmly believed he could use my blind devotion to build a highly illegal criminal empire and leave me rotting in a dark federal penitentiary. Julian Sterling stood trial in the very same towering federal courthouse where Agent Reynolds had brutally interrogated me while I was shivering in my damp silk pajamas. I sat quietly in the back row of the crowded courtroom every single day of the legal proceedings. Julian wore his bespoke tailored charcoal suits and desperately tried to flash his charming, arrogant smile at the jury panel. He instructed his high-priced corporate defense attorneys to loudly claim that I was the actual criminal mastermind. He wanted them to argue that because I was a licensed, certified public accountant, I had secretly manipulated the complex offshore accounts entirely without his knowledge. But his expensive legal team had absolutely nothing to counter the massive, devastating mountain of digital evidence Robert Hayes and I had provided to the federal prosecutors. The absolute climax of the trial occurred when the lead prosecutor dimmed the courtroom lights and played the hidden motel room video for the entire gallery to see. The massive digital projection screen showed Beatrice explicitly and proudly boasting about how Julian had meticulously planned the entire financial fraud exactly 2 years ago. The 12 members of the jury watched her cruel face sneer as she confidently called me a convenient idiot. They listened in absolute horrified silence as she explained exactly how Julian had flawlessly forged my electronic signatures to authorize offshore wire transfers while they were hiding out at a luxury golf resort in Arizona. She bragged on crystal-clear digital audio about securing generational wealth while I was lying unconscious on a ventilator in an intensive care unit. I sat in the wooden gallery benches and watched Julian sit at the heavy defense table as the color completely and violently drained from his face. His arrogant, rigid posture entirely collapsed inward. He realized in that exact horrifying moment that his own entitled mother had driven the final irrefutable nail directly into his legal coffin. The federal judge presiding over the case was absolutely merciless. He looked heavily down from the elevated bench and told Julian that his extensive financial crimes against the federal government were severe. But his deliberate, calculated attempt to completely destroy an innocent woman to cover his own tracks was purely and unapologetically evil. Julian was officially sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal prison with absolutely no possibility of early parole. As the armed bailiffs placed the heavy cold steel handcuffs on his wrists and led him roughly out of the silent courtroom, he turned his head to look at me one final time. There was absolutely no defiance left in his dark eyes. There was only the hollow, empty, crushing terror of an arrogant man who had permanently lost his entire kingdom. And speaking of losing a kingdom, the sheer poetic justice delivered to Beatrice and Brenda has been the most deeply satisfying resolution of all. The strict 60-minute eviction notice I gave them on the night of the dramatic federal raid was completely enforced. Agent Reynolds and his tactical team stood firmly in the grand foyer with their arms crossed, while Beatrice and Brenda frantically wept and stuffed their expensive designer clothes into whatever suitcases they could find. They were physically escorted off the pristine $3.4 million property in the freezing, pouring rain, carrying their heavy bags, just like they had forced me to do. Without Julian's stolen money, and without the massive luxury estate they falsely claimed to own, they were completely and utterly destitute. They are currently living in a cramped, dark, 2-bedroom apartment right next to a noisy, polluted, elevated highway on the very edge of the industrial city limits. The beautiful imported mahogany floors and spectacular Italian crystal chandeliers they love to flaunt have been replaced by cheap, peeling linoleum and flickering, harsh fluorescent lights. But the brutal loss of their material wealth was not even the worst punishment for them. The absolute worst punishment was their total, permanent social annihilation. The wealthy church elders, the elite corporate board members, and the high society wives who had gladly attended their lavish dinner parties entirely abandoned them. When the explosive news of the federal raid and the massive money laundering syndicate hit the front pages of the local papers, their entire elite social circle vanished overnight. Beatrice desperately tried to attend a Sunday morning service at her prestigious neighborhood church a few weeks after the massive arrest. The congregation literally turned their backs on her when she walked down the aisle. Wealthy women she had played tennis with for 20 years refused to even make basic eye contact. The social shunning was absolute, total, and completely devastating. Brenda, who had never worked a single hard day in her entire adult life, was forced to actually find a minimum wage retail job just to help pay the expensive rent for their tiny, dingy apartment. She now spends 8 hours a day folding clothes and serving the very same working-class people she used to cruelly look down upon. Beatrice spends her days sitting in a small living room, listening to the roar of highway traffic, completely stripped of all her fake superiority and aristocratic pride. They now live exactly the kind of pathetic, miserable life they used to mock me for, and they have absolutely no one to blame but themselves. As for the massive, sprawling suburban estate I had legally captured through Julian's own fatal corporate loophole, I did not stay there for very long. Walking through those grand, echoing hallways only reminded me of the decade I had spent actively making myself small to accommodate their massive toxic egos. 3 months ago, I officially put the beautiful property on the real estate market. Because of the spectacular custom kitchen and the high-end imported finishes, I had meticulously chosen the house sold in less than a single week to a wealthy technology executive for slightly over the asking price. I took the massive influx of clean legal capital from the sale and completely changed the trajectory of my entire life. I bought a beautiful, modest home in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood surrounded by tall, green, evergreen trees. But much more importantly, I used the substantial money to open my own independent financial firm. I am no longer managing real estate portfolios for arrogant, wealthy men who think they are above the law. I opened a highly specialized forensic accounting practice dedicated entirely to helping women who are victims of severe financial abuse and hidden domestic assets. I use my professional skills to track hidden bank accounts, expose fraudulent corporate shell companies, and completely dismantle complex financial traps set by narcissistic husbands during bitter divorces. When a terrified, broken woman walks into my office feeling like her entire world is violently ending because her husband has frozen her bank accounts and threatened to leave her with absolutely nothing, I look her directly in the eye and pour her a warm cup of coffee. I tell her that I know exactly how to find the undeniable truth. I use the very same forensic auditing skills that saved me from a dark federal prison cell to give these vulnerable women their financial freedom and their personal dignity back. Every single time I uncover a hidden offshore account or crack a forged corporate document for a client, I feel a profound, overwhelming sense of deep personal healing. I turned the absolute darkest terror of my entire life into a blazing, powerful beacon of hope for others. And I am not doing this deeply rewarding work entirely alone. The most incredibly beautiful part of this entire complicated aftermath has been Lucas. Julian's son, my stepson, was the absolute only piece of that toxic family that was genuinely pure and good. When the absolute truth of what Julian had meticulously done came to light, Lucas was completely devastated by his biological father's profound cruelty. He is 18 years old now, legally an adult, capable of making his own permanent choices. He watched his biological grandmother and his entitled aunt turn into vicious, cruel monsters when the federal pressure was applied. But he also watched me stand up and fight back with incredible integrity and unwavering grace. He chose me. He cut all communication ties with Beatrice and Brenda, and he packed his bags and moved into the new quiet house with me. He is currently attending the local university, heavily studying architecture and drafting. We have quiet, peaceful dinners together every single evening where nobody shouts, nobody belittles anyone, and nobody measures human love through expensive luxury gifts or high society status. We are simply a small family built entirely on mutual respect and genuine emotional care. He calls me Mom now, and every single time he says that simple word, it completely mends a tiny piece of my previously broken heart. I spent 10 long years honestly believing that if I just worked incredibly hard, cooked better gourmet meals, and kept the corporate finances perfectly balanced, I could eventually earn their unconditional love. I truly believed that completely shrinking myself to fit into their arrogant, demanding world was the absolute necessary price of being allowed to be part of a wealthy family. I was terribly and fundamentally wrong. Genuine love is absolutely not a financial transaction, and basic human respect is not something you have to constantly purchase through silent servitude. If you take absolutely anything away from my long, difficult story, please let it be this. Never let your absolute genuine kindness be mistaken for simple weakness. Narcissists and financial abusers will constantly try to back you into a dark, terrifying corner. They will actively try to use the complex legal system, the banking system, and even your own deep personal devotion completely against you. They will try to completely isolate you from your friends and make you firmly believe you have absolutely no power left in the world. When they do that to you, do not cry. Do not surrender to their demands. Do not let them see you break under the heavy pressure. You must learn their complicated game perfectly. You must quietly find their arrogant, fatal mistakes, because there is always a fatal mistake waiting to be discovered. Use the strict rules and the heavy weight of the law to methodically and ruthlessly take back exactly what is rightfully yours. You do not have to be violently cruel to be completely victorious. You just have to be incredibly smart, perfectly patient, and entirely unyielding. The absolute truth is a devastatingly powerful weapon if you have the incredible courage to wield it properly. I am so incredibly deeply grateful that I found the inner strength to fight back when all the legal and financial odds were stacked entirely against me. I went from a terrified woman in damp pajamas to a highly successful business owner who answers to absolutely no one. What did you think of how I handled my mother-in-law's absolute arrogance in the end? Have you ever had to carefully use the strict rules against someone who actively tried to break your spirit and steal your peace? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts, because I read every single one of them. If you truly believe that the undeniable truth always comes to light and that complete justice can actually be served, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Also, let me know what state you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Thank you so much for listening to my journey, and I will see you in the next story.